Hi, guys. Tonight, we are going to peel back the layers of a world that was painted in pastels, but felt like iron. We are traveling back to the mid-1950s, an era of white picket fences, the hum of new refrigerators, and the quiet, desperate pursuit of a perfection that didn't actually exist. Before we step into the soft glow of a 1955 suburban morning, I would love it if you just take a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. It truly helps these stories find their way to those who need a quiet escape into the past. And I'm curious, as you settle in tonight, where are you listening from? Is it a quiet bedroom, or perhaps you're listening while the world outside is still busy? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and hearing from you makes this journey feel a little less lonely. Now, settle in. Close your eyes. And let's talk about the dawn of the synthetic goddess. It is 5 a.m. in a quiet suburb of Ohio. The world outside is still blue, cold, and draped in a thick silence that only the very early hours possess. The streetlights are still humming their low, electric song, casting long, lonely shadows across the perfectly mowed lawns. Every house looks the same, a row of silent monuments to the American dream. But inside one of these houses, behind the floral curtains, the dream is already in motion. Inside a modest, yet perfectly manicured brick house, the alarm clock doesn't ring. It doesn't need to. The woman inside, let's call her Betty, has a biological clock tuned to the frequency of social expectation. She has been awake for minutes, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the precise moment to begin her transformation. She stirs, but she does not lounge. There is no luxury of a slow wake-up in this world. There is no rolling over for another 10 minutes of sleep. Sleep is a biological necessity, but for Betty, it is also a dangerous time when her guard is down. She slides out from under the heavy floral quilt, careful, so very careful, not to disturb her husband. He is still dreaming of the corporate ladder, of the chrome-plated future, of the promotion that will buy them a bigger television. He must not see her like this. Not in her raw state. Her feet, cold against the polished hardwood, find her silk slippers. They are pink, with a small marabou feather that shivers as she walks. And so begins the first ritual of the day. The long, lonely walk down the hallway to the bathroom. The bathroom is tiled in a pale, medicinal pink. It smells of soap, bleach, and something else, something chemical. The air is chilly, but she doesn't turn on the heater yet. The cold helps her wake up, it sharpens her senses for the work ahead. She stands before the vanity, and she looks. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the fluorescent bulb, she sees the truth she must spend the rest of her day hiding. This is the only time she is truly herself, and yet, it is the version of herself she hates the most. She sees the dark circles under her eyes from a restless sleep, the slight paleness of her skin, the messy reality of being human. In a mirror, she doesn't see a woman, she sees a project. A house that needs painting. A garden that needs weeding. But in the 1950s, being human was not enough for a housewife. She had to be a goddess, a synthetic, unchanging, unbreakable goddess of the domestic sphere. The advertisements in McCall's and Good Housekeeping told her so. They showed women in ball gowns standing over stoves. They showed women with perfectly coiffed hair while scrubbing floors. And Betty believed them. She had to. She reaches for a heavy glass jar of cold cream. The lid is silver, and it clicks as she unscrews it. The scent is thick, waxy, and nostalgic. Pond's, or perhaps Noxema. It is the scent of a million vanities across America. She applies it with practiced, upward strokes. She has been taught that gravity is her enemy, and that every movement must fight against the inevitable sag of time. Upward, always upward. Fighting the years, fighting the fatigue. The cold cream sits on her skin, a white mask in the mirror. She looks like a ghost. As she waits for it to work, she begins the process of removing the metal rollers from her hair. This is the most painful part of her secret life. She has slept all night with these rigid, cold cylinders pressing into her scalp. Every time she turned her head in her sleep, they bit into her skin. It's a low, constant throb of pain that she has learned to ignore, like the hum of the refrigerator. One by one, the rollers click as they hit the vanity. Click. 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 Her hair, stiffened by the chemicals of the previous night, falls into tight, unnatural coils. It doesn't move. It doesn't flow. It looks like a sculpture, not like hair. It is the architecture of conformity. She takes a brush with stiff bristles and begins to work. She isn't just brushing, she is setting. She is forcing every strand into its designated place. There is no room for a stray hair. A stray hair is a sign of a stray mind. Now, she wipes away the cream, and the construction begins. First, the foundation. In this era, foundation wasn't a light tint. It was a base. A thick, cake-like substance applied with a damp sponge. She dabs it on, blending it into her hairline, blending it down her neck. It fills in every pore, erases every freckle, and turns her face into a smooth, porcelain surface. It feels heavy, like a second skin, a mask that stays cool while her own skin suffocates beneath it. It is the foundation of her identity. She powders. The puff is soft, but the amount of powder is immense. A cloud of fine, floral-scented dust hangs in the air, settling on the glass of the mirror, settling on her eyelashes. She breathes it in, the taste of talc and roses. Her face is now matte, lifeless, and perfect. The shine of the night is gone. The reality of her skin is gone. She looks at her eyebrows. They are thin, almost invisible after the powder. She takes a sharp pencil, ebony or dark brown. She doesn't follow her natural brow. No. She draws a new one. An arch that is slightly higher, slightly more surprised, slightly more agreeable. This arch is a message. It says she is always interested, always listening, never angry. It is the face of a woman who never complains. Then, the eyes. The doe eye. She takes a small brush and a pot of black liner. A flick of the wrist, and a sharp line appears along her lashes. It ends in a small, upward wing. It makes her look alert, even though her body is screaming for more sleep. She adds coat after coat of mascara, until her lashes are like heavy shutters, framing her vision of the kitchen and the laundry room. And finally, the most important piece of the armor. The lipstick. She opens the gold-plated tube. The color is a deep, defiant red. Victory red, or fire and ice. She applies it with a brush, outlining the Cupid's bow with surgical precision. The lipstick is heavy, sticky, and it stains. It is the symbol of her patriotism, her femininity, and her submission. A housewife without her lipstick is a soldier without a uniform. She blots it with a tissue, leaving a perfect, red ghost of a smile on the paper. She looks at her reflection now. The sun is just beginning to bleed through the bathroom window, hitting the chrome faucet. The woman from an hour ago is gone. In her place stands the goddess of the kitchen. Her face is a masterpiece of synthetic materials. It is a face that can withstand the steam of a boiling pot, the spray of a vacuum cleaner, and the cold, distant gaze of a husband who expects his world to be beautiful. She leans in closer to the mirror. Just for a second. She looks into her own eyes, behind the mascara, behind the liner. There is a flicker of something there. A question. A tiredness that foundation cannot hide. But she blinks, and it is gone. The mask is too thick for questions. She turns off the bathroom light. The ritual is complete. She walks back into the bedroom, steps into her stiff, starched dress, and begins the long, silent walk to the kitchen. The sun is hitting the tops of the trees now. The world is about to wake up. And Betty, the synthetic goddess, is ready to perform. Her day has begun, long before anyone else's. Now, let's look closer. Let's pull the camera in until we can see the fine grains of powder and the sharp, unnatural lines. Because in the 1950s, a woman's face was not just a face. It was an architecture, a carefully engineered structure designed to project an image of stability, happiness, and unyielding order. It was a fortress of vanity built to withstand the pressures of a changing world. Imagine the vanity table once more. The light is stronger now as the morning sun begins to climb. The surface is cluttered with gold-capped tubes, frosted glass bottles, and brushes of every shape and size. Every tool has a specific purpose in this structural engineering of beauty. There is a science to this, a rigid set of rules that must be followed with military precision. To deviate from the standard of beauty was to be a failure, not just as a woman, but as a citizen. In an era of Cold War anxiety, the American housewife's face had to be the most stable, predictable thing in the room. Let's start with the eyebrows. In the 1950s, the brow was the anchor of the entire facial structure. It wasn't about following the natural growth of hair. No. Nature was something to be tamed, to be corrected. Betty takes a sharp ebony pencil. She has plucked her natural hairs until they are nearly invisible, leaving a blank, pale canvas for her to draft upon. This is not grooming, it is architectural drafting. She draws an arch that is high, dramatic, and perfectly symmetrical. The doe-eyed look. Think about that arch for a moment. It has a deep psychological purpose. It makes her eyes look permanently open, permanently surprised, permanently agreeable. It is the architecture of innocence and submission. It erases the possibility of a furrowed brow, the possibility of showing anger, frustration, or deep, critical thought. A housewife's brow must never look worried, even if her heart is heavy with a problem that has no name. Her face was designed to say yes, before her lips ever moved. It is a brow that suggests she is perpetually fascinated by the mundane details of a suburban life, even if she is screaming inside. She spends 10 minutes on the symmetry alone. One brow a fraction of a millimeter higher than the other would shatter the illusion of the perfect American woman. She uses a small, stiff brush to blend the pencil strokes until they look like shadows, making sure the edges are sharp enough to cut. It is a frame for a mind that society has told her should be simple, uncomplicated, and focused entirely on the shine of her linoleum floors. Then, we move to the eyes. The eyeliner. The liquid liner was a relatively new weapon in her cosmetic arsenal, a gift from the glamorous, distant world of Hollywood. She leans in, bracing her elbow on the cool vanity, holding her breath, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. A single, thin line along the upper lash line, ending in a sharp, upward flick at the outer corner. The cat eye. This flick was a masterpiece of geometry. It was designed to lift the eye, to create a sense of feline grace, a hint of the exotic within the suffocating confines of a 1950s kitchen. But it was a fragile grace. One rub of the eye from exhaustion, one tear of frustration, and the line would smudge, ruining the entire day's construction. And so, she learns the discipline of the eyes. She learns not to rub. She learns not to cry. The architecture of her face dictates the control of her soul. If the eyeliner stays perfect, it means the housewife is in control. It means the American home is safe. But the most complex part of the architecture, the hidden labor, was the contouring. Long before the modern era of social media, the 1950s housewife was a master of light and shadow. She used different shades of powder, pinks, ochres, and stark whites, to sharpen her jawline, to narrow her nose, to hollow out her cheeks. She is literally carving a new identity out of dust and pigment. Why? Because the magazines, the advertisements, and the television told her that a soft face was a weak face. She had to look as sharp as the edges of her new electric oven. Her cheekbones had to be high and defined, casting a shadow that suggested a diet of self-restraint, willpower, and perhaps a few diet pills from the family doctor. She was sculpting herself into a statue, a monument to the prosperity of her husband's career. Every shadow she drew was a way of hiding the softness of her own fatigue. Every highlight was a distraction from the dullness she felt in her spirit. And then, the lashes. Coating after coating of heavy, black mascara. In those days, it didn't come in a convenient tube. It was a dry cake of black pigment in a small metal tin. She had to spit on the tiny brush, or use a single drop of water from the tap, to create a thick, tar-like paste. She applies it until her lashes felt like heavy curtains, framing her vision of the world in a thick, black border. They were so thick they would often stick together, requiring her to separate them with a safety pin, a dangerous ritual performed inches from her pupil in the dim morning light. Think of the focus required, the absolute silence of the room. One slip, one blink, and the damage would be permanent. The risk she took was a testament to her dedication to the look. She ensured her gaze was as dramatic as a movie star's, even if the only person seeing it was the grocer or the woman next door who was doing the exact same thing. But we cannot talk about the architecture of the face without talking about the pout. The lips were the center of the 1950s universe. They were the only part of the face allowed to be bold, allowed to be loud. But even they were not allowed to be natural. Betty would overline her lips. She would use a lip liner to create a larger, fuller, more symmetrical Cupid's bow. The top lip had to be a perfect M shape, a symbol of sweetness, femininity, and a smile that never wavered. The color was non-negotiable. It had to be red. But not just any red. It was a saturated, blue-toned red that made her teeth look whiter and her smile look brighter. It was called the indelible look. It was a stain. Because even if she spent hours over a steaming stove, even if she vacuumed every inch of the house, even if she felt her world was hollow and shrinking, that red smile had to stay fixed in place. It was the seal of her perfection. A red stain on a porcelain coffee cup was the only evidence that she was a living, breathing being, capable of consuming anything. Think about the physical weight of it all. By the time she is finished, Betty is carrying nearly half a pound of product on her face. It is a physical weight, a constant reminder that she is on duty. It's hard to scream when you're afraid of cracking your foundation. It's hard to cry when you've spent 40 minutes on your eyeliner. The architecture was her cage, but it was also her pride. It was the only thing she truly owned in a world where her bank account, her home, and her very name belonged to her husband. She looks at her reflection now. The symmetry is flawless. Her face is a triumph of artifice over nature. It is a mask that reflects the perfect suburban life, a life of pastel appliances and polished chrome. But as she looks into the mirror, she doesn't see Betty. She doesn't see the girl who wanted to be an artist or a scientist. Betty is buried somewhere underneath 3 layers of powder, a gallon of hairspray, and the crushing weight of expectation. As the morning light fills the kitchen, she hears the footsteps of her children upstairs. The house is waking up. She takes one last look in the hallway mirror. The mask is perfect. The architecture holds. The perfect housewife is ready to be seen. She is ready to be the ornament in her husband's life. She is ready to be the envy of her neighbors. But as she turns away, she feels the stiffness of the makeup, a silent wall between her and the world she is about to serve. It is a face that demands respect, but it is also a face that forbids intimacy. You can admire a statue, but you can never truly touch it. And so, she walks into her day, beautiful, brittle, and entirely, perfectly, alone. Underneath the architecture, the foundation is starting to crack, but for now, the smile remains red, and the world remains quiet. Now, let's focus our quiet gaze on the most striking feature of the 1950s mask. The feature that commanded attention before a single word was ever spoken. The lips. Specifically, that deep, unyielding, saturated red. This was not just a simple choice of fashion or a passing trend of the season. No. In the mid-20th century, the red lip was a mandate, a social contract signed in wax, oil, and heavy pigment. To wear the red lip was to be a good woman, a patriotic wife, and a stable citizen. It was the anchor of her public identity, a red beacon of domestic success. Imagine the small, gold-plated tube sitting on the vanity. It reflects the morning light, looking almost like a piece of jewelry or a harmless toy. But inside that cold metal tube was a weapon of mass conformity. During the war years, just a decade before, red lipstick was promoted as a symbol of defiance against the enemy. Brands like Elizabeth Arden created shades called Victory Red to remind women that staying beautiful was part of the war effort, a way to keep spirits high while the world was at gray war. But by 1955, the war had shifted. The enemy was no longer an army across the ocean. The enemy was domestic instability, sadness, and the terrifying possibility of appearing unhappy in the land of the free. Betty picks up the tube now. She doesn't just swipe it on with a careless hand. That would be messy. That would be unrefined. In the world of the perfect housewife, precision was everything. She uses a lip brush. A tiny, fine-tipped tool with stiff bristles that allows her to sculpt her mouth into a shape that isn't quite hers. She starts by defining the Cupid's bow. The two peaks of the upper lip had to be perfectly symmetrical, perfectly pointed, like the twin gables of a suburban house. It was a geometry of the soul. If the peaks were too sharp, she looked predatory. If they were too soft, she looked weak. She had to find the exact middle ground of the ideal woman. Why red? Why this specific, bleeding heart of a color that dominated every bathroom mirror in America? Because red is the color of life, of passion, and of health. But on a housewife in 1955, it served a much darker, more clinical purpose. It was a massive distraction. It was meant to draw the eye away from the exhaustion in her gaze, away from the hollow rings under her eyes, and away from the paleness of her spirit. If a woman's lips were red, the world assumed she was fine. If her lips were painted, she was together. A woman without her lipstick in public was a woman who had let herself go. And in the manicured streets of the suburbs, letting yourself go was a sin that could not be easily forgiven. It suggested a lack of discipline, a failure of character. So Betty paints. She paints until her natural lip line is completely buried under a thick layer of fire and ice, or cherries in the snow. The application is a slow, meditative process, almost like a religious ritual. She outlines the edges first, overlining just a fraction of a millimeter to create a fuller, more youthful pout, the kind she sees on the movie posters at the local cinema. She fills in the center, layering the pigment until it is thick, opaque, and slightly heavy. It has a faint, sweet taste of vanilla, rose, and heavy chemicals. It dries into a semi-matte finish that doesn't budge. It is indelible, kiss-proof, smear-proof. It is a promise that she will remain perfect from breakfast until the last dish is dried at night. But let us think about what indelible truly means for a human being. It means it doesn't leave. It means it stays even when she wants to wash it away, even when she wants to disappear. It is a stain that marks her role in the household. When she drinks her first cup of black coffee of the day, she is careful, so incredibly careful, not to leave a red mark on the white porcelain cup. To leave a lip print was considered slightly vulgar, a sign that your makeup was not set properly, that you were leaking into your environment. So she drinks with her lips pulled back in a strange, strained movement that she has practiced in the mirror until it is second nature. The red lip was also a silent signal to her husband. When he came home from a long, soul-crushing day at the corporate office, he didn't want to see a woman who had spent 8 hours scrubbing floors, fighting with a temperamental washing machine, and changing soiled diapers. He didn't want the reality of labor. He wanted to see a pin-up in a floral kitchen apron. He wanted to see the woman he saw in the Technicolor advertisements for Chevrolets, refrigerators, and Coca-Cola. The red lipstick was his assurance that his world was still beautiful, that his investment in the suburban dream was paying dividends in beauty. But there is a much darker side to this mandate. The red lip was, in many ways, a gag. Have you ever noticed, in your own life, how difficult it is to truly express a deep, raw emotion when you are wearing a heavy coat of lipstick? You cannot bite your lip in anxiety without ruining the wax. You cannot press your mouth into a thin, hard line of anger without cracking the foundation. You cannot sob, you cannot truly howl in grief, without the red pigment running down your face like artificial blood, turning your sorrow into a grotesque spectacle. The red lip forced a smile. It held the mouth in a position of perpetual, pleasant neutrality. It was a cage made of pigment. It told the world that everything was wonderful, even when the walls of the house felt like they were closing in. It was a physical barrier against the truth. In the mid-50s, there were lipstick tests in every popular women's magazine. They would show you how to apply your color to match your personality, whether you were the sophisticate, the ingenue, or the devoted wife. But the reality was that every woman was being steered toward the same personality. The happy housewife, the cheerful mother, the supportive spouse. The red lip was the uniform of that role. It was the badge of the domestic soldier, fighting the war against unhappiness. Think of the chemical composition of that tube of red. It was made of castor oil, beeswax, and crushed insects or synthetic coal tar dyes. It was a product of the same industrial machine that was building fighter jets, high-rise office buildings, and atomic bombs. It was a synthetic beauty for a synthetic era. And just like the identical houses in her neighborhood, Betty's lips were a facade. A brightly painted front door that hid the empty, dusty rooms inside. As Betty moves through her long day, she reapplies the color multiple times. After the children leave for school. After she finishes the mid-morning vacuuming. Before the mailman arrives with the bills. And most importantly, 10 minutes before her husband's car pulls into the driveway. She carries a small, silver-cased mirror in her apron pocket, checking her lines every hour. It is a constant, nagging maintenance of the self. She is terrified of the fading. She is terrified of that mid-afternoon moment when the red begins to wear off and the pale, tired, human woman underneath is revealed in the mirror. Because that woman, the one with the thin, bloodless lips and the weary expression, is the one who remembers her old dreams. The one who remembers the books she once wanted to write, the travels she once planned, the life she thought she would have before she became an ornament. The red lip mandate was a wall. A thick, waxen wall between her and the world. A wall between her and her own reflection. As the evening sun begins to set, casting long, orange, distorted shadows across her clean kitchen floor, her lips are still red. They are the last thing she washes off at night, and the first thing she puts on in the dark of the morning. It is a cycle that never truly ends. A cycle of wax and pigment. A cycle of silence and smiles. Because in the world of 1955, a woman's voice didn't matter half as much as the color of her lips. Her thoughts were private, but her mouth was public property. And as long as they were red, the world believed she was happy. And as long as the world believed she was happy, she had to believe it too. The red lip holds the secrets of a million silent screams, buried under a layer of victory red. It is the most beautiful, and the most haunting lie ever told in the history of the American home. Now, as the morning air begins to warm slightly, we must turn our quiet attention to the most demanding, and perhaps the most architectural element of Betty's transformation. Her hair. In the 1950s, a woman's hair was not merely an extension of her body. It was a crown. But unlike the crowns of queens, this one was not made of gold and jewels. It was made of chemicals, wire, heat, and an incredible amount of physical endurance. It was a structure built to survive the day, even if the woman beneath it was crumbling. Let's go back to that quiet, pink-tiled bathroom. Betty is standing before the mirror, and she is about to unveil the structure she has been protecting all night long. We call it a routine, but for the mid-century housewife, it was more like sculpting the crown. It was a process of taking something wild, soft, and natural, and forcing it into a shape that was rigid, unmoving, and perfectly artificial. To have a hair out of place was not just a fashion mistake, it was a sign of a disordered life. The removal of the rollers is a slow, rhythmic ritual. Throughout the night, Betty's sleep was shallow, interrupted every time a cold metal clip pressed against her temple or a hard plastic cylinder dug into the nape of her neck. This was the price of beauty that every young girl was taught to pay without question. As she unclips the first roller, we hear the tiny, metallic snap. It is the sound of the day beginning. One by one, she unwinds them. The hair that emerges is not soft or flowing. It is stiff, frozen in the shape of the roller. It looks like a series of tight, vertical pipes encircling her head. This is the result of the home permanent she performed 2 nights ago. A process that involved harsh, ammonia-scented chemicals that burned her scalp and turned her hair into a substance that felt more like dry wool than silk. But it was necessary. Because in 1955, hair was not allowed to be free. It had to be set. Now, the real work begins. Betty picks up her brush, a heavy, stiff-bristled tool. She doesn't just brush her hair, she teases it. This is a violent process for such a delicate result. She takes a section of hair and combs it backward, toward the scalp, creating a tangled, matted base near the roots. It is called back combing or ratting. Think about the sensation of this. The constant pulling, the tugging at the roots, the sound of the hair fibers snapping under the pressure of the brush. She does this over and over, section by section, until her hair has doubled in volume. She is creating the foundation for the bubble or the page boy. It is an architecture of air and tangled strands. She is building a cage for her head, a structure that must stand tall through a long day of vacuuming, cooking, and social judgment. If her hair falls, her status falls with it. Once the volume is achieved, she begins the smoothing. With the lightest touch, she brushes the very top layer of hair over the matted mess beneath. It is a deception. To the world, her hair looks smooth, sleek, and effortless. But only Betty knows the chaotic, painful tangle that lies just an inch below the surface. It is a perfect metaphor for her entire life, a smooth, polished, lacquered exterior hiding a messy, complicated, and often painful reality. Next comes the spray. In the 1950s, hairspray was not a light mist. It was a lacquer. A chemical sealant designed to turn the hair into a helmet. Betty closes her eyes and holds her breath. The hiss of the aerosol fills the small bathroom, echoing off the porcelain. A thick, sticky cloud of shellac and heavy perfume surrounds her head. She sprays until her hair feels cold and damp. She sprays until the shape is locked in place like a monument. She waits for it to dry. When it does, her hair is no longer hair. It is a solid object. If a gust of wind were to blow through the kitchen window, her hair would not move. If her children were to hug her and accidentally brush against her head, they would feel something hard, unyielding, and slightly sharp to the touch. It is the sculpted crown. It is a symbol of her status, her discipline, and her unwavering commitment to the image. But let us talk about the long-term maintenance of this crown. Because the hair was so difficult to create, so painful to set, women often went a week or more without washing it. They would sleep in silk scarves, trying to keep the set from collapsing in the night. By the third or fourth day, the scalp would itch, the hair would become heavy with natural oils and the constant buildup of sticky spray, but she could not wash it. To wash it meant starting the entire, grueling process over again. So she lived in a constant state of discomfort, her head trapped in a chemical cage that smelled of old flowers and ozone. The crown also dictated her every movement. A woman with a set like Betty's could not afford to be spontaneous. She could not run through a sprinkler on a hot day with her children. She could not lean back comfortably on a plush sofa without fear of crushing the pageboy flip at the bottom of her neck. She had to move with a stiff, unnatural grace, keeping her head level at all times. Her hair was her master, and she was its eternal servant. Think of the deep irony of this beauty. This crown, which was supposed to be the height of femininity and charm, was actually a massive barrier to intimacy. A husband couldn't run his fingers through her hair in a moment of affection, for fear of getting stuck in the tangles of hairspray or ruining the shape. A child couldn't ruffle it in play. It was a decorative object, meant to be admired from a distance, but never touched. It was a wall of lacquer between the woman and those she loved. As Betty stands in the kitchen now, the bright morning sun hitting the rigid, glossy curves of her hair, she looks like a statue in a museum. The pageboy is perfect. The bangs are symmetrical. The flip is sharp and defined. But underneath that crown, her scalp still throbs from the pressure of the metal rollers. Her neck is stiff from sleeping in a fixed, awkward position to preserve the style. And the smell of the hairspray, that cloying, chemical scent, will follow her all day long. It will be there when she makes the beds. It will be there when she pours the juice. It will be a constant reminder with every breath she takes that she is a woman under construction. The sculpted crown was the final piece of the 1950s uniform. It was the weight she carried to prove she was worthy of her suburban life. It was beautiful, it was majestic, and it was a prison made of hair. And as she begins her chores, Betty knows that as long as the crown holds, as long as not a single hair is out of place, she is safe. She is the queen of the kitchen. Even if the crown is heavy, and even if it's starting to feel like it's slowly crushing her. As she reaches for the coffee pot, she catches her reflection in the polished chrome of the toaster. The hair doesn't move. Not a strand. Not a flicker. It is perfect. It is dead. And in this world, that was the goal. To be so perfect that you were no longer entirely alive. The crown is set. The day can now truly begin. Now that the mask is set and the crown of hair is lacquered into place, Betty moves to the final, and perhaps the most restrictive stage of her morning transformation. We must talk about the silhouette. In the mid-1950s, a woman's body was not allowed to exist in its natural state. It had to be molded, compressed, and re-sculpted into a very specific, very mathematical shape. The hourglass. She stands in the center of her bedroom, the morning light now streaming through the windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. On the edge of the bed lies the instrument of her daily discipline. The girdle. It is a formidable object. Made of thick, industrial-strength elastic, nylon, and reinforced with panels of stiffened fabric, or sometimes even flexible boning. It looks more like a medical device or a piece of armor than an undergarment. To the modern eye, it looks like a cage. To Betty, it is simply a necessity. She begins the process of stepping into it. This is not a simple task. It is a physical struggle, a battle between her soft, human flesh and the unyielding strength of the elastic. She has to pull it up, inch by inch, straining against the resistance of the material. Her face, usually so calm and composed, flushes with the effort. She has to twist and tug and breathe in, holding her breath until her lungs ache, just to get the garment over her hips. Once it is on, she begins the fastening. Some girdles have a row of tiny, silver hooks and eyes running up the front or the side. 10, 15, 20 hooks that must be aligned with trembling fingers. Each click of a hook is a step away from her physical comfort. Each click is a tightening of the social expectations around her waist. As she pulls the final hook into place, the transformation is immediate. Her stomach is flattened into a hard, unnatural plane. Her waist is cinched in, forced to be several inches smaller than it naturally wants to be. Her hips are rounded and smoothed. She looks in the full-length mirror, and for a moment, she can't breathe. Not really. The girdle doesn't just shape the body, it dictates how the body moves. In this garment, Betty cannot slouch. She cannot bend at the waist to pick up a toy from the floor without a sharp, pinching reminder from the boning against her ribs. She cannot take a deep, satisfying breath of air. Her breathing becomes shallow, confined to the upper part of her chest. It is a quiet, constant state of physical anxiety. Think about the physical toll of wearing this for 16 hours a day. The elastic is so tight that it leaves deep, red welts in her skin by the evening. It restricts her digestion. It makes her feel a constant, low-level pressure on her internal organs. But she has been told by the advertisements, by the doctors, and by the magazines that a loose body is a sign of a loose character. To be firm was to be virtuous. To be cinched was to be a lady. And then, there are the garters. Dangling from the bottom of the girdle are 4 or 6 elastic straps with metal clips. Betty sits on the edge of the bed, careful not to ruin the set of her hair, and begins the delicate task of attaching her silk stockings. She has to reach down, her movement restricted by the tightness around her middle, and clip the silk to the garter. The tension is precise. If the garter is too loose, her stockings will sag, a disaster that would make her look sloppy at the grocery store. If it is too tight, the strain will cause a run in the expensive silk, or worse, the clip will snap back and bite into her thigh. She lives in a world of constant, minor physical risks. As she stands up, she feels the full weight of the construction. The girdle, the stockings, the heavy brassiere that shapes her chest into the bullet silhouette of the era. She is no longer a woman of flesh and bone. She is a structure of elastic and wire. Now, she reaches for her dress. It is a shirtwaist dress, made of heavy, starched cotton with a floral print. It has been ironed until the collar is as sharp as a knife. She slides it over her head, the fabric rustling against her sculpted hair. She buttons the front, and then, she adds the final touch. The belt. She pulls the leather belt tight around her already cinched waist. 1, 2, 3 notches. She forces herself to fit into the smallest notch possible. It is the final seal on her silhouette. When she looks in the mirror now, she is the perfect housewife. She has the tiny waist, the flared skirt, the upright posture. She looks like a porcelain doll come to life. But let us think about the psychological weight of this silhouette. When a woman's body is constantly compressed, when her breathing is restricted, her mind begins to adapt to that pressure. The girdle taught women that their primary role was to be an object of display. It taught them that their own comfort was secondary to the visual satisfaction of others. Betty walks to the kitchen now. Every step she takes is a conscious effort. The garters pull at her stockings. The girdle pinches at her waist. The stiff fabric of her dress rubs against her shoulders. But she moves with a calculated, elegant grace. She has learned to hide the struggle. She has learned to smile through the restriction. Think of the irony of the new look. It was called new, but it was a return to the Victorian era of corsetry and confinement. After the freedom of the war years, when women wore trousers and worked in factories, the 1950s forced them back into a cage. But this cage was painted in pastel colors and sold with the promise of domestic happiness. As she begins to prepare breakfast, the physical discomfort becomes a background noise, like the hum of the refrigerator. She becomes numb to her own body. She has to. If she were to truly feel the tightness, the pinching, and the shortness of breath, she might scream. She might tear the garment off and throw it out the window. But she doesn't. She pours the orange juice. She cracks the eggs. She remains the synthetic goddess, held together by elastic and willpower. Throughout the day, she will not sit down properly. She will perch on the edge of chairs to avoid wrinkling her skirt or feeling the girdle dig too deeply into her stomach. She will not eat a full meal, for fear of the bloating that would make the garment unbearable. She exists in a state of constant, quiet hunger and physical restraint. This was the dark truth of the perfect housewife. Her beauty was a performance of endurance. Her silhouette was a masterpiece of suppression. She was a woman who was literally being squeezed out of her own life. And as the morning sun rises higher, illuminating the perfect home, Betty stands at the stove, a vision of 1950s grace. She is beautiful. She is elegant. She is a statue. And like a statue, she is trapped within the lines of her own design. The day has truly begun, and the girdle is tight. The cage is secure. And the world, looking on, sees only the perfection of the form, never the woman gasping for air inside. She adjusts her belt one last time, a small, unconscious movement. The pressure is there, a constant reminder of who she is supposed to be. A wife. A mother. A housewife. Anything but a human being who needs to breathe. Now, let us shift our quiet gaze downward, past the hem of the floral skirt, past the tension of the silk stockings, to the feet. We must talk about the sound of the 1950s kitchen. It wasn't just the bubbling of the coffee or the sizzle of the bacon. It was the rhythmic, sharp, constant click-clack of heels on linoleum. In this era, a housewife's day did not begin in comfortable slippers or sensible flats. No. To be the perfect housewife, Betty had to remain elevated. She had to be poised. Even as she stood over a steaming stove or scrubbed the grime from the kitchen tiles, she was expected to wear heels. Usually, they were kitten heels, or perhaps 2-inch pumps, with a narrow, tapering toe that squeezed her feet into a delicate, ladle-like point. Imagine the sensation. Betty stands at her kitchen counter, the cold, hard linoleum floor beneath her. There is no cushioning here. No orthopedic support. Just the thin, hard sole of a fashion shoe and the relentless pressure of gravity. By 7 a.m., she has already been on her feet for 2 hours. Her calves are already starting to tighten. The muscles in her lower back are beginning to sing with a low, dull ache that will stay with her until she finally unbuckles the straps late at night. But why? Why would a woman wear heels to perform manual labor in her own home? The answer, as always in the 1950s, was the image. Heels changed the way a woman stood. They forced the shoulders back, arched the spine, and made the legs look longer and more slender. They transformed the tired mother into a decorative object. Even while performing the most mundane tasks, like peeling potatoes or emptying the trash, she had to look as though she was ready to step onto the set of a television show. Think about the physical geometry of this. When you wear heels, your entire body weight is shifted forward onto the balls of your feet. The delicate bones of the toes are crushed together. The Achilles tendon is shortened. The knees are locked. For Betty, every step across the kitchen floor is a miniature feat of balance. She moves between the refrigerator, the sink, and the table with a stiff, practiced grace. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. It is the sound of her domestic duty. It is a sound that her husband and children have come to associate with home. To them, that rhythmic clicking means that breakfast is coming, that the house is clean, that mother is fine. They don't see the swelling in her ankles. They don't see the red, angry blisters forming on her heels. They only see the silhouette, and they only hear the rhythm of her productivity. Let's talk about the linoleum itself. It was the pride of the modern 1950s kitchen. Shiny, waxed, and patterned in bright pastels or checkered black and white. It was designed to be easy to clean, but it was also a slippery, unforgiving stage. Betty spends hours every week on her hands and knees, applying coat after coat of floor wax until the linoleum shines like a mirror. And then, she spends the rest of the week trying not to slip on her own hard work. The heels leave marks. Small, circular indentations in the soft wax. Scuff marks from the black rubber tips. And so, the cycle of labor continues. She wears the heels to look perfect, the heels ruin the floor, and she must scrub the floor to keep the house perfect. It is a closed loop of maintenance. A treadmill of beauty that she can never step off of. Think of the psychological impact of never being allowed to touch the ground. Betty is literally and metaphorically suspended from the earth. She is disconnected from the comfort of her own home. Even in her own sanctuary, she is a guest in a costume. She cannot walk softly. She cannot move with the natural, heavy gait of a tired human being. She must always be en point. Always ready to be observed. There were advertisements in the magazines showing women in glamorous dresses and heels vacuuming their living rooms with a smile. Housework is no excuse for a dowdy appearance, the captions would read. They suggested that a woman's femininity was a gift to her family, and that to take off her shoes was to withdraw that gift. It was a subtle form of emotional blackmail. If you love your husband, you will wear the pumps. If you care about your children, you will not let them see you in flats. By mid-morning, the pain is no longer a background noise. It is a sharp, throbbing reality. When she stands at the ironing board, pressing her husband's shirts until they are crisp and lifeless, the pain radiates up her legs and into her hips. She shifts her weight from one foot to the other, a silent, desperate dance of relief that never quite comes. She contemplates taking them off, just for a moment. Just while she irons. But she doesn't. What if the neighbor drops by to borrow a cup of sugar? What if the mailman knocks? What if she catches a glimpse of herself in the hall mirror and sees a woman who has surrendered? The shoes stay on. The armor remains. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being performative for 12 hours a day. It isn't just the physical tiredness of the muscles, it is the mental fatigue of never being able to be. Every movement is calculated. Every step is loud. She cannot sneak a moment of rest because her own shoes would betray her. The click-clack on the linoleum is a drumbeat that marks the passing of her life, one polished square at a time. As the afternoon sun hits the kitchen floor, reflecting off the high-gloss wax, Betty stands at the sink, washing the lunch dishes. The warm water feels good on her hands, but her feet feel like they are being squeezed in a vice. She looks down at her shoes. They are beautiful. Navy blue leather with a small, elegant bow. They are the very image of 1955 sophistication. And yet, they are instruments of torture. They are the final, cruel reminder that her body is not her own. It is a tool for the maintenance of the family's social standing. Her feet are the foundation of the house, and that foundation is aching. In the quiet of the afternoon, when the children are at school and the house is still, the sound of her heels is the only thing she hears. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. It is a lonely sound. It is the sound of a woman walking in circles, trapped in a beautiful, pastel-colored cage with a shiny, waxed floor. She imagines a world where she could walk barefoot through the grass, where she could feel the texture of the carpet between her toes. But then, she hears the car in the driveway. It is early. Perhaps a neighbor, or the delivery man. She immediately straightens her back. She checks her hair. She touches her red lips. And she begins to walk toward the door. The click-clack becomes faster, more purposeful. The pain is pushed down, buried under layers of discipline and hairspray. She opens the door with a bright, artificial smile. "Hello," she says. And the person at the door sees a woman who is perfectly put together. A woman who is elegant. A woman who is standing tall. They don't see the feet. They don't feel the ache in the arches. They don't know that the floor she stands on is a stage, and the shoes she wears are her shackles. The linoleum continues to shine, and the heels continue to click. The performance continues, and the dark truth remains hidden, just below the surface of the wax. Betty walks back to the kitchen to start dinner. The sun is beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows. The most painful hours are yet to come, the evening meal, the hosting, the standing, always the standing. But for now, she just listens to the sound of her own footsteps. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. The rhythm of the perfect housewife. The heartbeat of a synthetic world. Now, let us take a deep breath. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the air inside Betty's home. It is not a natural air. It does not smell of the earth, or the rain, or the changing seasons outside. No. The air inside a 1950s household was a carefully curated atmosphere, a sanctuary of synthetic fragrances designed to mask the raw, pungent reality of domestic labor. We must talk about the scent of a sanctuary. In this era, a home that smelled like a home was considered a failure. If the scent of fried onions from lunch lingered in the drapes, it was a sign of poor ventilation and a careless housewife. If the sharp, stinging aroma of bleach and ammonia from the morning scrubbing was too present, it suggested that the work was too hard, that the labor was too visible. Betty's job was to make the difficult work of cleaning disappear into a cloud of floral perfume and chemical freshness. Imagine Betty standing in the center of her living room. The housework is nearly done for the morning, but the air is heavy with the ghost of her chores. There is the metallic tang of the silver polish she used on the tea set. There is the waxy, heavy scent of the floor paste. And there is the smell of her own perspiration, trapped beneath the layers of her girdle and the starched cotton of her dress. To the 1950s nose, these were honest smells, but honest was not the goal. Perfect was the goal. She reaches for a can of air freshener. This was the dawn of the aerosol age. The can is cold in her hand, decorated with images of pine trees or spring meadows. With a practiced flick of her finger, she releases a fine, misty spray into the air. Hiss. Hiss. The mist settles on the upholstery, the carpets, and the wallpaper. It doesn't actually remove the odors, it simply covers them with a thick, synthetic layer of pine or lavender. It is a chemical veil, a way of pretending that the kitchen doesn't exist, that the trash hasn't been emptied, that the world is perpetually in bloom. But the scent of the sanctuary didn't stop with the rooms. It extended to Betty herself. A housewife was expected to be a fragrant presence. She had to smell like a garden, even when she was elbow-deep in dishwater. Betty returns to her vanity. She picks up a large, fluffy puff and a decorative tin of body powder. This was an essential part of the mid-century feminine ritual. The powder is fine, silky, and scented with lily of the valley or rose. She dusts it over her neck, her arms, and beneath the edges of her restrictive undergarments. A cloud of white dust rises around her, settling on the glass of her perfume bottles. Think about the purpose of this powder. It was designed to absorb moisture, to keep her skin dry and ladylike in an era before widespread air conditioning. But more than that, it was a way of softening her body. It turned her skin into a velvet surface, masking the heat and the friction of her labor. When her husband hugged her, he shouldn't feel the warmth of a woman who had been working all day. He should feel the cool, dry, floral-scented surface of a goddess. Then, there is the perfume. The final seal on the atmosphere. Betty doesn't wear something light or modern. She wears something heavy, something with clout. Chanel No. 5. Or perhaps Evening in Paris. These were scents made of musk, jasmine, and aldehydes. They were sophisticated, nocturnal, and entirely unnatural. She dabs a drop behind each ear, and a drop on her wrists. As the perfume reacts with the heat of her skin, it begins to radiate. It follows her like a shadow as she moves through the house. It marks her territory. It tells the world that this house is under control. It tells her children that mother is ready. But think of the sensory overload. The pine air freshener, the floral body powder, the musky perfume, the scent of the hairspray, the waxy smell of the lipstick. Betty is a walking chemistry set. She is a sanctuary within a sanctuary. But there is a price to pay for this curated air. The constant inhalation of these sprays and powders takes a toll. Many women of the era suffered from housewife's headache, a dull, throbbing pain behind the eyes caused by the lack of fresh air and the overwhelming presence of synthetic fumes. But Betty simply takes an aspirin, pours another cup of coffee, and continues. To open a window and let in the wild air of the outside world was to admit that the sanctuary was a fragile illusion. Let us look at the laundry. Even the clothes had to smell of perfection. Betty uses a new brand of detergent, one that promises to make her whites whiter than white and leave them smelling like a summer breeze. But a summer breeze doesn't smell like blue dye and sodium perborate. It smells of grass and sun. Betty's laundry smells of the factory. It smells of the laboratory. It is a cleanliness that is aggressive, a cleanliness that demands to be noticed. When she hangs the sheets on the line in the backyard, she is performing for her neighbors. The sight of the white sheets snapping in the wind is a visual scent, a signal of her domestic prowess. But even there, in the open air, she is thinking about the scent. She brings them in before they lose that laundry smell. She irons them with scented starch, pressing the fragrance into the very fibers of the cotton. When her husband returns in the evening, he steps through the front door and is greeted by this wall of fragrance. To him, it is the smell of success. It is the smell of a wife who is doing her job. He doesn't smell the bleach she used to scrub the toilet. He doesn't smell the sweat of her brow. He doesn't smell the boredom. He only smells the pine, the roses, and the Chanel. The scent of the sanctuary was a form of sensory deprivation. By drowning out the natural smells of life, the smell of cooking, the smell of bodies, the smell of the earth, the 1950s home became a sterile, disconnected space. It was a place where nothing was allowed to decay, where nothing was allowed to be real. It was a museum of fragrances. Think of the irony. Betty spends her entire day cleaning, yet she spends her entire afternoon trying to hide the fact that she cleaned. She is ashamed of her own labor. She is ashamed of the evidence of her own effort. The perfume is her apology for being a human being who has to work. In the quiet moments of the late afternoon, when the sun is low and the house is silent, Betty sits down for 5 minutes. The scent of the air freshener is starting to fade, and a tiny hint of the evening's roast beef begins to creep out from the kitchen. She immediately feels a sense of panic. She stands up, reaches for the can, and sprays again. Hiss. Hiss. The floral mist falls over her like rain. It settles on her hair. It settles on her lips. She is safe again. The sanctuary is restored. But as she stands there, surrounded by the smell of a meadow that doesn't exist, she feels a strange sense of suffocation. It isn't just the girdle, or the heels, or the hairspray. It is the air itself. It is too sweet. It is too thick. It is too perfect. She longs for the smell of the sea. She longs for the smell of a forest after a storm. She longs for the smell of a life that hasn't been bottled and sold in a gold-capped tube. But those smells are dangerous. Those smells are unrefined. Those smells belong to a woman who doesn't have a white picket fence and a shiny refrigerator. So she puts the can back on the shelf. She straightens her apron. She checks her red lips in the mirror one last time. She is the synthetic goddess in her synthetic garden. The air is still. The fragrance is heavy, and the dark truth remains buried beneath a layer of lily of the valley and aerosol pine. The day is moving toward its end. Soon the family will be gathered around the table. They will eat their meal in the scented air, unaware of the labor it took to create this fragrant vacuum. They will look at Betty and see a woman who is as fresh as a spring morning, never knowing that she is drowning in the very scent she created to please them. The sanctuary is quiet. The sanctuary is clean. And the sanctuary, above all else, is perfectly, beautifully fragrant. The sun has finally cleared the horizon, casting long, golden streaks of light across the linoleum floor we discussed earlier. The house is no longer silent. Upstairs, the heavy footsteps of a husband and the high-pitched calls of children begin to echo. This is the moment Betty has been preparing for since 5 a.m. This is the curtain call. The breakfast performance is about to begin. In the 1950s, breakfast was not just a meal. It was a stage play, a daily demonstration of the stability and prosperity of the American family. And Betty is the director, the lead actress, and the stagehand, all at once. But the most important rule of this performance is that the audience, her family, must never see the effort. They must never see the sweat, the timing, or the mechanical precision required to make it all look effortless. Imagine the kitchen table. It is covered in a crisp, yellow-checked cloth, ironed so flat it looks like a sheet of paper. On it, Betty has laid out the silver, the napkins, and the glasses of orange juice. Each glass is perfectly chilled, placed at a precise 90-degree angle to the plate. The orange juice isn't fresh squeezed, it's from a can, but Betty has stirred it until every frozen crystal has vanished, making it look like liquid gold in the morning light. She stands at the stove, her back straight, her heels clicking softly as she moves between the frying pan and the toaster. Sizzle. Pop. The sound of the bacon is the soundtrack to her labor. She has to time it perfectly. The bacon must be crisp, but not burnt. The eggs must be sunny side up, with the yolks perfectly centered and the whites set like white velvet. If a yolk breaks, she feels a surge of genuine panic. A broken yolk is a flaw in the performance. A broken yolk suggests that she is not in control of her domain. Think about the heat in the kitchen. The stove is radiating a dry, intense warmth. Betty is wearing her girdle, her heavy dress, and her scuppleted crown of hairspray. She is starting to feel the heat prickle against her skin, but she cannot wipe her brow. To wipe her brow would be to smudge her foundation. To show heat would be to show the physical reality of work. So she stands there, a synthetic goddess over a hot flame, appearing as cool and composed as a statue in a park. The husband enters first. He is dressed in his gray flannel suit, his tie knotted with corporate precision. He sits down and opens the morning paper. He doesn't look at Betty. He doesn't need to. He assumes the coffee will be there. He assumes the toast will be hot. To him, the breakfast is a natural occurrence, like the sun rising in the east. He doesn't see the woman who has been awake for 3 hours, building this moment piece by piece. Betty pours his coffee. She does it with a steady hand, careful not to let a single drop splash onto the white saucer. She places the cup to his right, exactly where he expects it to be. "Good morning, dear," she says. Her voice is a soft, melodic hum, practiced to perfection. It is a voice that contains no trace of the 5 a.m. cold, or the pain in her feet, or the tightness in her chest. It is a voice designed to reassure him that his world is safe. Then, the children arrive. They are loud, messy, and full of the chaotic energy of the morning. For Betty, they are the greatest challenge to the performance. She must manage their spills, their complaints, and their demands, all while maintaining the mask of happiness. If a child spills his juice, she doesn't scold with a raised voice. She smiles, a thin, red-lipped smile, and wipes it away with a cloth she keeps hidden in her apron pocket. She erases the mess before it can become a reality. Think of the mental gymnastics Betty is performing. She is tracking the toast in the electric toaster. She is monitoring the eggs. She is listening for the kettle. She is watching her husband's face for any sign of dissatisfaction. And she is doing all of this while remaining decorative. She is the heart of the home, but she is also its most invisible servant. There is a specific kind of loneliness in the breakfast performance. She is surrounded by the people she loves, yet she is entirely separate from them. They are eating. They are talking about their day. They are living. Betty, on the other hand, is working. She does not sit down with them. "I'll eat later," she says, a lie she tells every single morning. The truth is, she cannot eat. Her girdle is too tight to allow for a full stomach. Her nerves are too frayed to allow for an appetite. She survives on black coffee and the high-octane energy of her own anxiety. She watches them consume the food she has prepared, and in their consumption, she finds a strange, hollow sense of worth. She is the provider of the American morning. Let's talk about the toaster. The 1950s was the age of the modern appliance. The chrome toaster sitting on Betty's counter is a symbol of technological progress. It is shiny, bright, and efficient. But for Betty, it is another master to serve. The toast must be the exact shade of golden brown. If it is too light, it is raw. If it is too dark, it is charred. There is no room for error in the world of the synthetic goddess. As the meal nears its end, the performance shifts into its final act. The departure. She helps her husband with his coat. She brushes a stray lint from his shoulder. She hands him his briefcase. She kisses him on the cheek, careful, so very careful, not to leave a red mark of lipstick on his skin. A mark would be a sign of her leakage into his world. He must leave the house clean, unburdened by the evidence of her affection or her labor. Then, the children are ushered out the door to the school bus. "Have a wonderful day," she calls out, her voice ringing across the manicured lawn. She stands in the doorway, waving, a vision of suburban bliss for the neighbors to see. She stays there until the bus disappears around the corner, and her husband's car is gone from the driveway. The performance is over. She turns back into the house. The silence that follows is sudden and heavy. It hits her like a physical weight. She looks at the table. The yellow checked cloth is now stained with crumbs. The glasses are empty, with sticky rings of juice at the bottom. The plates are smeared with the yellow remains of eggs and the grease of bacon. The stage is a mess. Betty stands in the center of the kitchen, her shoulders finally sagging just a fraction. The breakfast performance lasted only 30 minutes, but it has drained her as if she had run a marathon. Her feet are throbbing in her heels. Her waist is aching against the girdle. The smell of the bacon is now cloying and greasy in the morning air. She takes a deep breath, the synthetic scent of her perfume mixing with the smell of the dirty dishes. She doesn't sit down. She cannot. Because the next performance is already starting. The cleaning ritual. The laundry symphony. The grocery runway. She picks up the first plate. She begins to scrape the remains into the trash. Scrape. Scrape. The sound is lonely in the empty house. She looks at the empty chairs, and for a fleeting moment, she wonders if they even saw her. Did they see the woman, or did they only see the breakfast? Did they see the human, or did they only see the goddess? But she pushes the thought away. To think is to crack the foundation. To wonder is to smudge the eyeliner. She turns on the hot water. The steam rises, clouding the window, hiding the world outside. She disappears into the suds. This was the breakfast performance of 1955. A daily sacrifice of the self on the altar of the perfect home. It was a meal made of love, but also of fear. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being just a woman. Fear of the silence that waited for her once the door was closed. As she washes the dishes, she begins to hum a tune she heard on the radio. It is a cheerful tune, a bright tune, a tune that hides the dark truth. She is Betty, the synthetic goddess. And she has 16 hours of performance left before she can finally, mercifully, take off her shoes. The morning sun is high now. The house is clean once more. The stage is reset. And underneath the red lipstick, the smile remains fixed, awaiting the next audience. The family has departed, the echoes of the breakfast performance have faded into the corners of the rooms, and now the house belongs to Betty once again. But she is not alone. She is never truly alone. She is accompanied by a silent, invisible judge that follows her from room to room. We must talk about the invisible white glove test. In the mid-1950s, cleanliness was not just a chore. It was a moral imperative. A speck of dust on a mahogany side table was not merely a sign of a busy morning, it was seen as a character flaw. A smudge on a window pane was a symptom of a failing marriage. A stained carpet was a mark of a mother who had lost her way. Cleanliness was the yardstick by which a woman's soul was measured. Imagine Betty standing in the center of her living room, the silence of the house ringing in her ears. The morning sun, while beautiful, is her greatest enemy. It streams through the glass, illuminating every microscopic particle of dust dancing in the air. It highlights the faint, ghostly fingerprints on the door frames. It exposes the tiny, nearly invisible crumbs caught in the fibers of the rug. To the world, this room is perfect. But to Betty, it is a battlefield. She reaches into her utility closet. This is her armory. It is filled with the latest weapons of the chemical age. Sprays, waxes, polishes, and powders. Everything smells of lemon, pine, or sharp, stinging ammonia. She takes a soft, white flannel cloth. It is clean, lint-free, and ready to be sacrificed to the god of the white glove. The term white glove test comes from an old tradition where a visitor, perhaps a mother-in-law or a judgmental neighbor, would run a gloved finger along the top of a door frame or the back of a picture frame. If the glove came away white, the housewife was virtuous. If it came away gray, she was shamed. But for Betty, the test is no longer physical. It has become internal. She carries the white glove in her mind, checking her own performance every hour of every day. She begins with the wood. The 1950s home was a forest of polished mahogany, oak, and walnut. Every surface had to shine with a deep, liquid luster. Betty applies a thick, lemon-scented wax to the coffee table. She rubs in small, circular motions. Rub. Rub. The physical effort is immense. Her shoulders, already stiff from her morning routine, begin to throb. But she does not stop. She polishes until she can see her own red-lipped reflection in the wood. But as she polishes, she thinks about the invisibility of her work. If she does her job perfectly, no one notices. Her husband will come home and set his briefcase on the table, never realizing that it took 40 minutes of labor to make that surface shine. Her children will drop their books on the sideboard, unaware of the sweat she spilled to keep the wood pristine. Her labor is only visible when it is not done. Failure is loud, but perfection is silent. Think about the psychological toll of this silence. To work for hours on a task that is designed to be unnoticed is to become invisible yourself. Betty is the ghost in the machine of the home. She erases the evidence of life as soon as it appears. A child plays with blocks. She tidies them before the husband returns. A dog leaves a muddy print. She scrubs it before it can dry. She is constantly fighting against the natural entropy of a living family. Next, she moves to the windows. The eyes of the house. In the 1950s suburbs, privacy was a luxury, but observation was a duty. Your neighbors were always watching. They watched to see if your curtains were straight. They watched to see if your windows were clear. Betty uses a spray that smells of sharp vinegar and blue dye. She wipes and buffs until the glass disappears entirely. She stands back and looks through the transparent pane. She sees the woman across the street, let's call her Martha, doing the exact same thing. They wave at each other, two synthetic goddesses in their respective glass cages. It is a silent, mutual recognition of the test. Martha's windows are clear, so Martha is a good woman. Betty's windows are clear, so Betty is safe for another day. But let us look into the dark corners. The places the neighbors can't see. The inside of the kitchen drawers. The back of the linen closet. The tops of the baseboards behind the sofa. This is where the invisible white glove test becomes truly cruel. Even when the house looks perfect to the outside world, Betty knows where the dust is hiding. She knows about the one corner she missed yesterday. It haunts her. She finds herself on her hands and knees, scrubbing the grout between the bathroom tiles with a toothbrush. The smell of the bleach is overwhelming, making her eyes water and her throat dry. Her sculpted crown of hair is threatened by the humidity of the bathroom, but she persists. Scrub. Scrub. Why does she do this? No one will ever see the grout in the corner behind the pedestal sink. No one will ever look there. But she knows. And in the world of 1955, a woman's self-worth was entirely tied to the hidden cleanliness of her home. If a drawer was messy, she felt messy inside. If a closet was disorganized, she felt her life was spiraling out of control. The house was not just a building, it was an externalization of her own mind. A dirty house meant a dirty mind. Think of the chemical warfare she conducts daily. The 1950s was the era of the modern miracle. New soaps, new detergents, new disinfectants. They promised to kill 99% of germs. They promised to make housework a breeze. But they actually increased the workload. Because now that it was possible to be germ-free, it was required to be germ-free. The bar was raised every year. The test became harder. Betty spends her afternoon vacuuming. The machine is heavy, a roaring, clunky monster that pulls at her back. She moves it in perfect, diagonal lines across the carpet. She wants to see the vacuum tracks. Those tracks are her signature. They are the proof that she was here. They are the evidence that she passed the test. But the tragedy of the white glove test is that it must be taken again every single day. Cleanliness is a temporary state. Dust never stops falling. Skin cells never stop shedding. The world is constantly trying to reclaim the house. And so, Betty can never truly rest. Even when she sits down for 5 minutes with her black coffee, her eyes are scanning the room. She sees a cobweb in the high corner. She sees a smudge on the brass lamp. Her mind is a checklist that never ends. She is a prisoner of her own standards. Standards that were sold to her by men in Madison Avenue offices who had never scrubbed a floor in their lives. They sold her the test, and she bought it with her time, her health, and her sanity. As the afternoon sun begins to shift, casting longer, dimmer shadows, Betty finishes the living room. She stands back, her hands red and dry from the chemicals, her feet throbbing in her heels. The room is a masterpiece. It is sterile. It is shining. It is lifeless. It looks like a page from a catalog, not a place where people live. She has passed the test. For today. She takes one last look around before moving to the kitchen to prepare the next performance. She runs her own finger along the top of the bookshelf. It comes away clean. A small, hollow victory. Underneath the red lipstick, she feels a flicker of satisfaction, but it is immediately followed by a wave of profound exhaustion. The invisible white glove test is not about dirt. It is about control. In a world where she has no power, she can at least control the dust. In a world that ignores her, she can at least make the mahogany shine. But as she walks away, leaving her fingerprints on the air as she moves, she knows the dust is already beginning to settle. The judge is waiting. The test will begin again tomorrow at 5 a.m. And Betty, the synthetic goddess, will be there to take it. With her red lips, her sculpted hair, and her white, flannel cloth, she will continue to fight the invisible war. Because in 1955, a clean house was the only way to prove you were alive. The house is quiet. The house is shining. And the dark truth remains, hidden in the only place the white glove cannot reach, the hollow space inside Betty's own heart. The sun is now high in the mid-morning sky, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light over the suburban landscape. The interior chores are momentarily paused. The vacuum is back in its dark closet, the white flannel cloth is folded away. But for Betty, the work does not stop. It merely changes location. It is time for the weekly trip to the supermarket. But in the world of 1955, this is not a simple errand. It is a public appearance. We must talk about the grocery store runway. Imagine Betty standing in her hallway, checking her reflection one last time before she dares to open the front door. To step outside into the gaze of the neighborhood is to step onto a stage. She does not reach for a comfortable coat or a pair of sensible walking shoes. No. She puts on her town suit, a structured, navy wool ensemble with covered buttons and a skirt that falls to the precise, modest mid-calf. She adds her white gloves, spotless and crisp, and a small, structured hat that sits perfectly atop her lacquered crown of hair. She looks like she is going to a garden party, or perhaps a high-stakes business meeting. But she is only going to buy milk, eggs, and a tin of coffee. Think about the psychological pressure of this excursion. In the suburbs, the grocery store was the town square. It was the place where the invisible white glove test went public. Every woman in the neighborhood would be there, and every woman would be judging. They would judge the quality of her suit. They would judge the straightness of her stocking seams. They would judge the shade of her red lipstick. To go to the store looking unkempt was to broadcast to the entire community that your home was in disorder, that your marriage was failing, and that you had lost your grip on the American dream. Betty picks up her leather handbag, hooks it over her arm in the practiced, elegant way she was taught in charm school, and steps out into the bright, white heat of the morning. She climbs into the family car, a heavy, chrome-laden sedan that smells of new vinyl and gasoline. As she drives the few blocks to the new, modern supermarket, she feels the weight of the performance. She has to navigate the car while wearing her girdle, her heels, and her restrictive suit, all while maintaining a look of serene, effortless beauty. She is a pilot in a high-fashion cockpit. The supermarket itself is a temple of 1950s progress. It is vast, air-conditioned, and filled with the humming of massive refrigerators and the bright, fluorescent glare of the future. But as Betty pushes her chrome shopping cart through the aisles, she isn't just looking at the labels. She is aware of every person she passes. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. The sound of her heels on the polished, checkered floor echoes through the aisles of canned peas and boxed cake mixes. It is the same sound as her kitchen, but here it is louder. It is a signal to the other women. I am here, the sound says. I am perfect. I am disciplined. I am winning. She encounters Martha in the produce aisle. Martha is also wearing a suit. Martha is also wearing gloves. They exchange a perfect housewife greeting. A soft, modulated hello, dear. A thin, red-lipped smile that doesn't reach the eyes. They stand by the pyramids of oranges, two synthetic goddesses in a competition they never asked to join. They glance at each other's carts. This is the true test of the grocery store. What is Betty buying? Is she buying fresh vegetables, which suggests she spends hours in the kitchen? Or is she buying the new, modern frozen dinners, which suggests she is a woman of the future, or perhaps a woman who is getting lazy? Every item in the cart is a piece of evidence. A box of luxury chocolates suggests a husband who is successful. A bargain brand of detergent suggests a household that is struggling. Betty is careful to curate her cart. She places the expensive cuts of meat on top. She hides the convenience foods beneath a layer of fresh lettuce. She is shopping for an image, as much as for sustenance. The cart is a reflection of her status, and she cannot let it be messy. Think about the physical exhaustion of this trip. The supermarket is large. She has to walk miles of aisles in her heels. The air conditioning is cold, biting at her skin, but she cannot shiver. The weight of the heavy glass jars and tins pulls at her arms, but she must lift them with grace. She is performing manual labor in a high-fashion costume. It is a grueling, silent marathon. And then, there is the interaction with the staff. The checkout clerk, usually a young man, is another judge. Betty must be charming, but distant. She must be efficient, but gracious. As she stands in the checkout line, she feels the eyes of the people behind her. They are looking at her back, checking for a stray thread, checking to see if her girdle is visible through the fabric of her skirt. She stands perfectly straight, her spine a rigid line of social defiance. As she pays, she is careful with her white gloves. She has to handle the money without staining the fabric. It is a tiny, absurd challenge that occupies her entire focus. Everything is a task. Everything is a potential failure. She pushes the heavy cart out into the parking lot. The heat of the sun hits her like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the refrigerated air of the store. She begins the process of loading the heavy bags into the trunk of the car. She has to lift them carefully, bending at the knees to avoid showing her slip or tearing her stockings. Her face is starting to feel damp beneath the heavy foundation. She can feel a bead of sweat beginning to form at her hairline, near her sculpted crown. She freezes. She cannot let it run. If the sweat runs, the foundation will streak. If the foundation streaks, the mask is broken. She quickly reaches into her handbag and pulls out a lace handkerchief. She dabs, she does not rub, she dabs at her forehead with the precision of an artist. The mask is saved. She drives back to the quiet, tree-lined street of her neighborhood. As she pulls into the driveway, she sees the other houses, all identical, all quiet, all hiding the same labor. She feels a sudden, overwhelming sense of futility. She has spent 2 hours, and a significant amount of mental energy, just to buy groceries. She has dressed up like a movie star to stand in a line at a cash register. But then, she sees her neighbor, let's call her Helen, standing in her own driveway, waving. Helen is wearing a dress and pearls just to collect the mail. And Betty realizes that the runway never ends. The performance is continuous. She begins to carry the bags into the house. 1 trip, 2 trips, 3 trips. Her heels sink into the soft grass of the lawn. Her arms are aching. The silk of her gloves is starting to feel sticky. But she keeps the smile on her face. She keeps the hat straight. Inside the house, she sets the bags on the counter. The silence of the kitchen greets her. She is back in her sanctuary. But she is exhausted. Truly, deeply, bone-wearily exhausted. She wants to kick off her heels and sit on the floor. She wants to take off the suit and breathe. But she looks at the clock. It is nearly noon. The children will be home for lunch soon. The performance must continue. She must unpack the groceries. She must put the milk in the refrigerator, the meat in the freezer, the bread in the box. She must do it all with the same mechanical perfection. She takes off her gloves. Her hands are pale, and the rings on her fingers leave deep, red indentations in her skin. She looks at her red lips in the toaster reflection. They are still perfect. Victory red. She begins to unpack. The rustle of the brown paper bags is the only sound in the room. Each item she puts away is a promise to keep going, to keep cooking, to keep cleaning, to keep performing. The grocery store trip was just a change of scenery. The runway has simply moved back into the kitchen. Think of the millions of women who performed this exact same dance every week. A million suits, a million pairs of gloves, a million red-lipped smiles in the aisles of supermarkets across the nation. It was a collective, silent theater. A way of proving to each other that they were okay, that the dream was real, that the perfection was worth the pain. Betty folds the empty paper bags and tucks them away. She straightens her hat in the hallway mirror. She is ready for the next act. The sun is still shining. The house is still clean. And the perfect housewife is still standing, even if her feet are screaming and her soul is quietly, slowly, fading away into the pastel wallpaper. The runway is clear. The audience is waiting. And the dark truth remains, hidden behind the structured wool of a navy suit and the white silk of a gloved hand. The clock on the kitchen wall ticks with a heavy, mechanical rhythm. Tick. Tick. It is now the middle of the afternoon. The grocery store runway is over, the lunch dishes have been dried and stacked away with clinical precision, and the children have returned to school. The house has fallen back into that thick, suffocating silence that Betty knows all too well. This is the hour of the midday meltdown. And this is the hour when many women reach for a secret, silent ally. We must talk about Mother's Little Helper. Imagine Betty sitting at her yellow formica kitchen table. For the first time since 5 a.m., she is still. She doesn't have a broom in her hand. She doesn't have a child on her hip. She is simply existing. And in this stillness, the dark truth begins to rise to the surface like a ghost. The exhaustion in her legs, the throbbing in her temples, and that strange, hollow ache in her chest that she cannot name. It is a feeling of being completely full, and yet entirely empty. She looks at her hands. They are stained with the faint smell of bleach and the red residue of the afternoon's tomatoes. She looks at the perfectly waxed floor, the gleaming appliances, the floral wallpaper that she spent weeks choosing. It is a beautiful world. It is the world she was promised. So why does she feel as though she is drowning in it? In the 1950s, there was no language for this feeling. To speak of unhappiness was to admit failure. To admit boredom was to be ungrateful. So the women of the suburbs kept their silence. But the silence became too heavy to bear. The midday meltdown wasn't a loud, dramatic explosion. No. It was a quiet, internal collapse. A moment where the mask of the synthetic goddess felt too heavy for the neck to carry. Betty stands up. Her movement is slow, almost trance-like. She walks over to the medicine cabinet in the pink-tiled bathroom. Behind the mirror, tucked away behind the aspirin and the bandages, sits a small, amber-colored glass bottle. The label is typed in a neat, professional font. It is a prescription for Milltown, or perhaps Equinol. These were the first tranquilizers, the miracle drugs of the mid-century. They were marketed specifically to women like Betty. The advertisements in medical journals showed a stressed, frowning housewife transformed into a smiling, serene angel after taking a single pill. For the anxiety of everyday life, the ads promised. to help her cope with the demands of the modern home. Betty opens the bottle. The sound of the plastic cap clicking is small, but in the silence of the house, it sounds like a gunshot. She takes out a tiny, white pill. It looks so innocent, so harmless. It is her little helper. She swallows it with a sip of lukewarm water. Gulp. She returns to the kitchen and waits. Within 20 minutes, the edges of the world begin to soften. The ticking of the clock feels further away. The sharp, stinging pressure of the girdle around her waist becomes a dull, distant hum. The panic that was rising in her throat, the feeling that she was disappearing into the wallpaper, slowly recedes like a tide. She feels leveled. Not happy, but not sad either. Just flat. Think about the tragedy of this chemical solution. Instead of questioning why the house was so lonely, or why her life felt so small, the world told Betty that she was the problem. Her nerves were the issue. Her adjustment to her role was faulty. The pill was designed to fix the woman, so the house could remain unchanged. It was a way of sedating the rebellion before it could even begin. The 1950s was a decade of chemical peace. Millions of women were walking through their beautiful, pastel-colored lives in a state of mild sedation. It was the only way to endure the perfection. You couldn't be a synthetic goddess without a little synthetic help. The red lipstick stayed on easier when you couldn't feel your own mouth trembling. The white glove test was less terrifying when your brain was wrapped in cotton wool. But the little helper had a twin sister. The diet pill. As Betty stands by the window, watching the mailman move down the street, she feels a surge of artificial energy. Many of these prescriptions were actually amphetamines, pep pills. They were given to housewives to help them keep up with the cleaning and to ensure they never gained a single pound of weight. Think of the physical contradiction. Betty is taking one pill to calm her down and another pill to speed her up. She is a biological machine being driven by external chemicals. Her heart is racing, her hands are slightly shaky, but she is productive. She can vacuum for 3 hours without stopping. She can iron 10 shirts without feeling the ache in her back. She is the super housewife, powered by a laboratory. And the side effect? The loss of appetite. This was seen as a bonus. In a world where a woman's worth was tied to the size of her waist, the diet pill was her best friend. It helped her remain the sculpted silhouette her husband expected. She doesn't eat lunch. She doesn't eat dinner. She lives on coffee, cigarettes, and the chemicals in the amber bottle. By 3 p.m., Betty is a whirlwind of activity. She is scrubbing the baseboards. She is polishing the silver for the 3rd time this week. She is moving with a frantic, jagged energy that she mistakes for purpose. But if you look closely at her eyes, the doe-eye eyeliner is framing a gaze that is wide, glassy, and hollow. She is present, but she is not there. The midday meltdown has been averted, but at what cost? The chemicals have erased the sadness, but they have also erased the joy. They have killed the anger, but they have also killed the passion. Betty has become as synthetic as the linoleum she walks on. She has become a ghost in her own home, a beautifully dressed specter haunting a life that belongs to everyone but her. Think of the millions of women performing this same ritual behind closed doors. A secret epidemic of sedation. It was the silent fuel that ran the suburbs. It kept the lawns mowed, the children fed, and the husbands comfortable. It kept the American dream from waking up and realizing it was a nightmare. As the children finally return from school, Betty greets them with a bright, artificial smile. "How was your day, darlings?" she asks. Her voice is steady. Her hands don't shake when she pours the milk. The little helper has done its job. She is the perfect mother again. But inside, behind the red lips and the sedated gaze, there is a small, quiet part of Betty that is terrified. She is terrified of the moment the pill wears off. She is terrified of the silence that will return when the bottle is empty. She is terrified that if she stops taking the chemicals, she will shatter like a glass ornament dropped on a hard kitchen floor. She watches her children eat their snack. She listens to their stories about school. She nods in all the right places. She is the perfect actress in the perfect play. But the script is written in a language she no longer understands. She is a stranger to her own life. The afternoon sun is beginning to lower, casting long, orange shadows through the kitchen window. The house is clean. The children are safe. The dinner is in the oven. The sanctuary is secure. Betty reaches into her apron pocket and feels the small, hard shape of the amber bottle. It is her comfort. It is her curse. It is the only thing that makes the perfection possible. The dark truth of the 1950s was not just the labor, or the girdle, or the heels. It was the loneliness that was so profound it required medical intervention. It was the sadness that was so widespread it became a market for the pharmaceutical industry. As she stands at the sink, washing the snack plates, Betty looks at her reflection in the window. The sun is hitting her face, highlighting the architecture of her makeup. She looks beautiful. She looks calm. She looks like the woman on the television. And as the mother's little helper continues to hum in her veins, she tells herself that she is lucky. She has everything she ever wanted. She has the house, the husband, the children, and the white picket fence. And if she needs a little white pill to help her believe it, then that is just the price of the dream. The kitchen is quiet. The meltdown is over. And Betty, the synthetic goddess, continues her dance, perfectly poised, perfectly sedated, and perfectly, tragically, invisible. The day is almost over. Soon the husband will return. Soon the evening performance will begin. And the amber bottle will stay hidden, a silent witness to the truth that no one is allowed to say out loud. The late afternoon sun is now casting long, distorted shadows across the checkered linoleum floor. The hum of the refrigerator feels louder now, a steady, electric heartbeat in the silence of the house. Betty stands in the center of her kitchen, but she is no longer just a cook. In the world of 1955, she has become a technician, a chemist, a scientist of the domestic sphere. We must talk about the kitchen as a laboratory. In this era, the act of preparing a meal was being stripped of its ancient, earthy traditions. The kitchen was no longer a place of raw ingredients, wooden spoons, and slow, simmering stews. It had been transformed into a sleek, chrome-plated laboratory where food was something to be engineered. It was the age of the modern miracle, where the industrial power that built the atomic bomb was now being applied to the family dinner. Imagine Betty opening her cupboards. They are not filled with sacks of flour or bundles of fresh herbs. They are filled with brightly colored boxes, gleaming tin cans, and glass jars of neon-colored preserves. Everything is instant. Everything is condensed. Everything is scientifically proven. To be a modern housewife, Betty was taught to trust the laboratory more than her own senses. She was taught that processed meant safe, and that canned meant perfect. She reaches for a box of gelatin, the magical, translucent dust that defined the 1950s palette. This is the start of her afternoon project. The Jell-O salad. Think about the strange, chemical nature of this dish. Betty boils water, the steam rising into her sculpted crown of hair. She stirs the powder into the water, a bright, artificial lime green that glows under the fluorescent lights of the kitchen. This isn't food found in nature. This is a liquid plastic, a substance that can be molded into any shape she desires. She doesn't just add fruit to it. No. The laboratory mindset requires something more complex. She adds canned tuna, shredded cabbage, and dollops of thick, white mayonnaise. She pours the mixture into a gleaming, ring-shaped mold. This is the aspic. As she places the mold into the refrigerator, she is not thinking about flavor. She is thinking about the aesthetic of control. In the 1950s, food had to be contained. It had to be rigid. It had to be suspended in a state of crystalline perfection. A meal that was messy, a meal that ran across the plate, was a meal that was undisciplined. But a gelatin salad stayed exactly where you put it. It was a triumph of order over the chaos of organic matter. Think about the psychological impact of this kind of cooking. Betty is no longer using her hands to feel the dough, or her nose to smell the ripening of the fruit. She is following a manual. She is measuring, timing, and mixing according to instructions written by men in laboratory coats. Her intuition is being replaced by efficiency. Her creativity is being replaced by assembly. The kitchen is filled with the sounds of this new industry. The sharp clink of a can opener. The whoosh of a pressure cooker. The rhythmic whir of the electric mixer. These are not the sounds of a home, they are the sounds of a factory floor. Betty is the supervisor of this production line, her heels clicking on the linoleum as she moves between the workstations. Next, she prepares the meat. It doesn't come from a local butcher. It comes in a rectangular tin, a pink, spongy block of Spam or treat. It is meat that has been stabilized. It is meat that will never rot, never change, and never challenge her. She slices it with surgical precision, laying the pieces out on a baking sheet like tiles on a roof. She covers the meat in a glaze made of brown sugar, mustard, and more canned pineapple rings. Everything must be decorated. Everything must be a presentation. In the world of the synthetic goddess, food was not meant to nourish the body so much as it was meant to impress the eye. A dinner was a visual argument for the success of the American way of life. But let us look at the sensory reality of this laboratory. The smells are sharp and metallic. The scent of the mother's little helper in her system makes the bright colors of the food seem even more vivid, almost hallucinogenic. The neon greens, the pastel pinks, the stark whites of the marshmallow salads. It is a dreamscape of sugar and preservatives. Betty is tired. Her feet are throbbing, her back is aching, and the heat from the oven is making her foundation feel like it's melting. But she persists. She is creating the dinner performance. Think of the TV dinner. This was the ultimate achievement of the kitchen laboratory. A meal that arrived in a frozen, 3-compartment aluminum tray. Meat in one square, peas in another, potatoes in the third. It was the total segregation of flavor. It was food that required no skill, only the ability to turn a dial on a stove. It was advertised as freedom for the housewife, but it was actually a final, total surrender to the corporation. Betty doesn't serve TV dinners every night, that would be lazy, but she uses the same logic. She uses canned soups as sauces. She uses instant flakes for her mashed potatoes. She is obsessed with shortcuts. But why does a woman who has 16 hours a day to spend at home need so many shortcuts? The answer is the standard of cleanliness. The time she saves in the kitchen laboratory is time she must spend on her hands and knees scrubbing the grout. The scientific food is designed to be clean. It doesn't splatter. It doesn't leave grease on the walls. It is litter-free. The food has been designed to serve the house, not the people living in it. As the afternoon light turns a deep, bruised purple, Betty begins the final assembly of the dessert. A baked Alaska or a chiffon cake. It is a structure of air and egg whites, held together by chemical stabilizers. It is a tower of sweetness that looks like it belongs on a pedestal, not a plate. She stands back and looks at her laboratory. The counters are wiped clean of any evidence. The sink is empty. The trash is hidden. On the stove, the various components of the meal are simmering in their modern pots. The house is starting to smell of the evening meal, but she immediately reaches for her scent of a sanctuary spray. Hiss. Hiss. She masks the smell of the food with the smell of the meadow. Even the act of eating must be sanitized. Think of the children who grew up in this laboratory. Children who learned that food came from cans, that color was something added in a factory, and that fresh was a word used for laundry, not for vegetables. They are the first generation of the synthetic world, born into a kitchen that was as sterile and controlled as a hospital ward. Betty checks her watch. Her husband will be home in 20 minutes. She must leave the laboratory and return to being the hostess. She checks her red lips. She adjusts her sculpted crown. She wipes a single, microscopic drop of sauce from the chrome handle of the oven. The dinner performance is ready. The laboratory has produced its results. The table is set with the same, cold, checked cloth. The glasses are filled. The gelatin salad is shivering on its plate, a translucent green monument to her discipline. Betty feels a sudden, sharp pang of hunger. But she ignores it. The smell of the processed meat and the sweet, chemical gelatin makes her stomach turn. She hasn't eaten a real meal in days, surviving on coffee and the pills from the amber bottle. She has become a ghost in her own kitchen, a technician who never tastes the product. She turns off the overhead light and leaves the room. The laboratory is dark now, illuminated only by the small, blue flame of the pilot light on the stove. It is a place of cold surfaces, sharp edges, and engineered dreams. The dark truth of the 1950s kitchen was that it was no longer the heart of the home. It was the engine room. A place where the housewife was worked like a machine to produce an image of prosperity. The modern food was a lie, a colorful, sugar-coated lie designed to hide the fact that the family was drifting apart, eating identical, lonely meals in a perfectly decorated vacuum. Betty walks to the front door to wait for her husband's car. She stands straight. She smiles. She is ready for the world to see her success. But the laboratory stays behind her, silent, humming, and filled with the shivering, green remains of a woman's life. The sun has finally set. The night is coming. And in the laboratory, the chemicals are settling, the gelatin is hardening, and the silence, as always, is the most persistent ingredient of all. The evening light has begun to fade into a soft, bruised purple, stretching the shadows of the white picket fence across the driveway. Inside the house, the air is still, heavy with the scent of a sanctuary spray and the lingering, metallic hum of the kitchen laboratory. But we must move away from the rooms and back to the woman herself. We must talk about the silhouette of silence. We must talk about the quiet, relentless war Betty wages against her own body every single day. In the mid-1950s, a woman's size was not just a matter of health. It was a matter of social standing. It was a matter of her husband's pride. To be a perfect housewife, Betty had to be trim. She had to be slender. She had to maintain the hourglass silhouette that the magazines and the billboards demanded. A woman who gained weight was seen as a woman who had lost her discipline, a woman who had surrendered to the chaos of her own life. Imagine Betty standing in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom. It is the late afternoon checkup. She has already been through the morning ritual, the grocery runway, and the kitchen laboratory. But now, she is looking at the line of her waist. She pulls the tape measure from her sewing basket. The tape measure is her judge. She wraps it around her waist, cinching it tight until it bites into the fabric of her dress. 24 inches. Perhaps 25. Every fraction of an inch is a battleground. If the number is higher than it was yesterday, a cold, sharp spike of anxiety shoots through her chest. She is not seeing a body, she is seeing a mathematical failure. She is seeing a silhouette that is losing its silence. Think about the diet culture of 1955. It wasn't about nutrition. It wasn't about energy. It was about shrinking. The advertisements told her that her appetite was an enemy to be conquered. They sold her aids for weight loss, candies that were supposed to curb her hunger, sparkling waters that were meant to fill her stomach with nothing but air. But the real aid was silence. The silence of not eating. Betty has not had a real meal since Tuesday. For breakfast, she had black coffee and a single slice of dry toast. For lunch, she stood at the counter and ate a single stalk of celery while she prepared the elaborate, three-course meal for her children. She fed them the meat, the potatoes, the buttered peas, and the gelatin salad, but she only consumed the idea of food. She lives in a state of permanent, low-level hunger. It is a hunger that makes her head light, her hands shaky, and her temper short. But she has been taught to interpret this hunger as a virtue. To feel hungry was to be feminine. To be empty was to be perfect. The silhouette of silence required her to be as close to invisible as possible, while still occupying space as a decorative object. Think of the coffee and cigarette diet. This was the fuel of the suburban housewife. Betty sits at the kitchen table, the house quiet for a moment. She lights a cigarette. The smoke curls in the air, blue and ghostly in the dim light. The nicotine dulls the gnawing ache in her stomach. The caffeine from her fourth cup of coffee keeps her heart racing, giving her the nervous energy she needs to continue her chores. It is a chemical balance of power, a way of maintaining the silhouette without having to nourish the soul. But let us look at the social weight of this silence. When Betty goes to her bridge club or her neighborhood coffee klatch, the conversation is a minefield of body judgment. "Oh, Betty, you look so thin," is the highest compliment she can receive. It is a validation of her suffering. It is a signal from her peers that she is winning the war. But if a neighbor says, "You look so healthy," Betty hears it as an insult. To look healthy meant you were sturdy. And to be sturdy was to be a peasant, not a synthetic goddess. The pressure came from the doctors, too. In the 1950s, many physicians would prescribe amphetamines, those pep pills we discussed, not just for energy, but specifically for weight control. They told women that being fat was a sign of emotional maladjustment. They told them that if they loved their husbands, they would stay attractive. And so, Betty takes the pill. She takes the pill to kill the hunger, to kill the desire, to kill the part of her that wants to take a big, messy bite out of life. The silhouette was also a cage. Think of the fashion. The new look skirts were heavy, sometimes using 20 yards of fabric. But the waist was tiny. To fit into those clothes, Betty had to keep her body in a state of constant suppression. Her body was not a vehicle for movement, it was a hanger for the clothes. She could not breathe deeply. She could not run. She could only stand, poised, brittle, and small. There is a profound loneliness in this hunger. At night, when she lies in bed beside her husband, her stomach occasionally growls in the dark. It is a loud, embarrassing sound in the silence of the bedroom. She pulls the quilt up to hide the noise, terrified that he will hear her need. She doesn't want him to know that the perfect housewife is actually a starving woman. She wants him to believe that her beauty is effortless, that her smallness is natural, that she is a creature who lives on air and sunshine. But the dark truth is that Betty is obsessed. Her mind is a calculator of calories. She knows the cost of every bite. A bite of the children's cookie is 20 minutes of scrubbing the floor. A pat of butter on her toast is an extra hour of vacuuming. Her entire life has become a system of trade-offs. She trades her health for her dress size. She trades her joy for her husband's approval. She trades herself for a shadow. Let us look at the mirror ritual again. Betty turns to the side. She sucks in her stomach until her ribs show. She checks the line of her chin, looking for any sign of a double that would suggest she has been indulgent. Indulgence was a dirty word in the suburbs. To indulge was to be weak. To indulge was to be common. And yet, the world around her is filled with food. The television commercials show dripping roasts, overflowing bowls of ice cream, and towering cakes. The magazines are filled with recipes for hearty family meals. Betty is expected to be the provider of plenty, while remaining a symbol of scarcity. She must cook the feast, but she must never join it. She is the priestess at the altar of consumption who is forbidden from eating the sacrifice. Think of the diet pills and the tranquilizers working together. One to keep her thin, one to keep her from caring that she is starving. It is a perfect, chemical silhouette. She is walking through her house in a state of mild, hunger-induced hallucination. The colors of the walls seem a bit too bright. The sound of the children's voices seems a bit too sharp. She is drifting away from the reality of her own flesh. By the time the husband returns in the evening, Betty is at her smallest. The girdle has been tight all day, her stomach is empty, and her face is drawn and sharp. This is the look he expects. He sees a woman who is elegant, refined, and controlled. He doesn't see the woman who almost fainted while she was hanging the laundry. He doesn't see the woman who had to sit down for 10 minutes because her heart was fluttering from the caffeine and the hunger. He sits at the head of the table. Betty serves him a massive portion of the meatloaf and the mashed potatoes. She sits down at the other end. Her plate has a small mound of cottage cheese and a single half of a grapefruit. This is her dinner. Not hungry tonight, dear? He asks, his eyes already back on the newspaper. No, dear, she says, her voice a thin, red-lipped whisper. I had a big lunch. Another lie. Another brick in the wall of silence. The silhouette of silence was the ultimate performance of the 1950s. It was a way for a woman to prove she was in total control of her animal nature. She was not a being with needs, or desires, or hungers. She was a silhouette. A shape. A ghost in a floral dress. As she washes the dinner dishes, the hunger is a sharp, burning coal in her chest. She looks at the leftover meatloaf on the plate she is about to scrape into the trash. For a split second, she wants to grab it with her bare hands and eat it standing there at the sink. She wants to taste the salt, the fat, the reality of it. But she looks at her reflection in the dark window. She sees the high cheekbones. She sees the tiny waist. She sees the goddess. She scrapes the plate into the trash. Scrape. Scrape. The hunger stays. The silence stays. And Betty continues her dance, perfectly thin, perfectly poised, and perfectly, tragically empty. The dark truth of the 1950s diet culture was that it was a slow, socially sanctioned starvation of the American woman. It was a way to make sure she never had the strength to run away. It was a way to make sure her voice remained small, because her body was too weak to shout. The house is quiet. The kitchen is clean. And the silhouette remains, standing in the fading light, a beautiful, brittle shadow of the woman she was meant to be. The afternoon sun has finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the suburban streets in a soft, indigo twilight. Inside the house, the lights are beginning to flicker on, casting warm, orange glows through the windows. But before the front door opens, before the husband's car pulls into the gravel driveway, we must talk about the way Betty moves. We must talk about the posture of submission. In the mid-1950s, a woman's body was not just a machine for labor, or a silhouette for fashion. It was a vessel for poise. But poise, in this era, was often a polite word for restriction. From the moment she was a young girl, Betty had been trained in the art of making herself smaller, quieter, and more decorative. She had been taught that her physical presence should never be aggressive, never be loud, and never take up more space than absolutely necessary. Imagine Betty standing in the center of her living room, waiting. Even when she is alone, she does not relax. She does not slump into a chair. She does not throw her arms out. No. She stands with her feet angled, one slightly in front of the other, the model's pivot she learned in a charm class. Her shoulders are rolled back, her chin is lifted, and her hands are folded gently at her waist. This is the posture of a woman who is always ready to be observed. Think about the physical training required for this grace. In the 1950s, charm schools and finishing courses were not just for the elite. They were for every girl who hoped to find a husband and a home in the suburbs. Betty remembers the lessons. She remembers walking across a room with a heavy book balanced on her head. If the book fell, it was a failure of her femininity. She remembers learning how to sit in a way that never revealed the line of her thighs. She remembers learning how to enter a room without making a sound. This was the architecture of the body. It was a way of living that turned every movement into a performance of submission. When she sits, she does not just sit. She descends. She keeps her knees pressed together, her ankles crossed, her back never touching the rear of the chair. This is known as perching. It is a position of constant, low-level muscle tension. It is a position that says, I am here to serve, not to be comfortable. Think of the psychological impact of never being at rest in your own home. For Betty, her own furniture is a stage. The plush sofa, the wingback chair, the kitchen stool, none of them are for relaxation. They are props in a play about the perfect life. If she were to sprawl out, to stretch her limbs, to occupy the space she actually needs, she would feel a sense of profound shame. It would be unladylike. And in 1955, to be unladylike was to be invisible to the world that mattered. Let's look at her hands. The posture of submission extended even to the fingertips. A woman's hands were never supposed to look like they did work. Even though Betty has spent the day scrubbing, lifting, and cleaning, she has been taught to hold her hands as if they were made of glass. When she holds a teacup, her pinky finger is slightly raised, a tiny, absurd gesture of refinement. When she speaks, she uses small, delicate gestures, keeping her elbows tucked close to her ribs. This tucking in of the body was symbolic. It was a physical manifestation of her social position. A man could stretch his arms out, he could lean back with his hands behind his head, he could take up the entire room with his voice and his presence. But Betty had to be a miniature. She had to be a doll. The smaller she made herself, the more successful she was as a wife. Think about the way she walks. It is not a stride. It is a glide. Because of the heels we discussed, and the restrictive girdle, her steps are short and rhythmic. Click. Click. She moves as if she is on a track. There is no swing in her hips, no power in her gait. She is a creature of the interior, designed for narrow hallways and carpeted rooms. To see her run would be a shock, a violent break in the posturing. But let us talk about the voice that accompanies this posture. In the 1950s, a woman's voice was expected to be a soft melody. Betty has practiced her telephone voice and her husband voice. It is a tone that is slightly higher than her natural range, breathy, and perpetually cheerful. It is a voice that avoids hard consonants and loud exclamations. When she speaks, she often tilts her head slightly to the side. This is a classic, submissive gesture. It signals that she is listening, that she is non-threatening, that she is agreeable. If she has an opinion that differs from her husband's, she wraps it in so many layers of politeness and softness that the opinion itself disappears. She doesn't say, "I disagree." She says, "Do you think, perhaps, dear, that it might be another way?" The posture of submission was a way of avoiding conflict. In the nuclear age, the home was supposed to be a haven of peace. And Betty was the guardian of that peace. But peace was maintained through her own self-effacement. She became a mirror for the men in her life. If her husband was happy, she was a bright, reflecting pool. If he was angry, she was a calm, absorbing surface. She had no independent weather of her own. Think of the second shift of this posturing. As the evening draws near, the physical fatigue is overwhelming. The girdle is biting, the heels are burning, and the mother's little helper is starting to wear off. But she cannot let her posture slip. This is the most important part of the day. The homecoming. She hears the car. Thump. The car door closes. Betty immediately checks her stance in the hallway mirror. She straightens her spine. She tucks her elbows in. She tilts her head to that perfect angle. She prepares the red-lipped smile. As her husband walks through the door, she is there. A vision of submissive grace. She doesn't run to him with the chaotic news of her day. She doesn't tell him about the broken vacuum or the loneliness that felt like a physical weight at 3 p.m. No. She takes his coat. She offers him his slippers. She leads him to his chair. She moves around him like a planet around a sun. Her movements are designed to facilitate his comfort, to enhance his sense of mastery. She sits on the edge of the ottoman at his feet, or perhaps on the arm of his chair, making herself smaller, lower, more devoted. This is the posture of the helpmeet. A word that sounds like partnership but felt like servitude. But look at the cost of this physical performance. The constant tucking in and straightening up leads to chronic tension. Betty's neck muscles are like iron cables. Her lower back is in a permanent state of spasm. She suffers from suburban migraines, headaches that start at the base of the skull and move forward, born from the effort of holding her head at an agreeable angle for 16 hours a day. The posture of submission was a slow, physical erasure. By training her body to be an ornament, Betty was training her mind to be a ghost. If you cannot move freely, you cannot think freely. If you cannot take up space with your body, you cannot take up space with your soul. As they sit in the living room, the blue light of the television flickering against the floral wallpaper, Betty remains in her perched position. She is tired, so very tired, that she feels she might simply dissolve into the fabric of the chair. But she stays straight. She stays poised. She stays silent. She watches her husband relax. She watches him occupy the room. And she realizes, in a fleeting, dangerous moment of clarity, that her poise is actually her prison. Her grace is her gag. But then, he looks at her and smiles. "You look lovely tonight, Betty," he says. And the posture holds. The red lips widen. The head tilts. "Thank you, dear," she whispers, her voice as soft as the silk of her scarf. The posturing has worked. The submission is complete. The perfect housewife has passed the final test of the day. The room is quiet. The television hums. And the dark truth remains, hidden in the rigid spine, the tucked elbows, and the silent, aching body of the woman who has learned how to be perfect by learning how to disappear. The night is deep now. The performance is almost over. But even in her dreams, Betty will sleep straight, her hands folded, her body still holding the shape of the world's expectations. Because for the synthetic goddess, there is no such thing as rest. There is only the posture. And the posture is forever. The clock on the mantelpiece chimes 4 times, a soft, silver sound that cuts through the heavy silence of the house. The long, golden fingers of the late afternoon sun are stretching across the living room carpet, highlighting the dust motes that Betty has spent all day chasing. But for Betty, this chime is a signal. It is the warning bell for the final act of her day. It is time for the afternoon refresh. We must talk about this hidden hour. The hour between the end of the chores and the sound of the car in the driveway. In the world of 1955, a housewife's greatest fear was to be caught unprepared, to be seen by her husband as a woman who had been working, to look tired, to look sweaty, or to have a single strand of hair out of place was to break the spell of the synthetic goddess. And so, she must erase the evidence of her own life, once again. Imagine Betty standing in the kitchen, the smell of the evening roast already beginning to fill the air. She is exhausted. Her feet are burning in her heels, her back is a dull, constant ache, and her foundation, applied over 10 hours ago, is beginning to crack and fade. But she does not sit down. She moves toward the bathroom, the pink-tiled sanctuary where her day began. This is the second shift of beauty. She stands before the mirror, and for the first time since 5 a.m., she truly looks at herself. The architecture of the face we discussed earlier is under siege. The steam from the kitchen has softened her sculpted crown. The heat of the afternoon sun has caused a faint, glistening sheen of perspiration on her forehead. Her red lipstick has faded in the center, leaving only a ghostly outline of the perfect pout. To anyone else, she looks like a woman who has worked hard for her family. But to Betty, she looks like a failure. She begins the refresh. But this is not a gentle touch-up. This is a restoration project. She reaches for her mother's little helper one last time, swallowing the white pill with a splash of cold water to give her the nervous energy she needs to finish the day. Then, she reaches for the cold cream. She doesn't remove all her makeup, there isn't time for that. Instead, she blots. She takes a clean, white tissue and presses it firmly against her skin, absorbing the oils and the sweat of the day's labor. She is literally pressing her exhaustion into the paper, and then she throws it away. Out of sight. Out of mind. Next, she reapplies the powder. Puff. Puff. The fine, floral-scented dust rises in a cloud, settling over the bathroom tiles. She layers it on until her face is once again a matte, lifeless surface of porcelain. The reflections of reality are buried under a fresh coat of white talc. Then, she turns to her hair. The lacquer from the morning has become brittle. She takes a small, fine-toothed comb and gently teases the pageboy flip back into its rigid position. She doesn't want it to look soft. She wants it to look set. She releases another, sharp hiss of hairspray, shellacking the crown until it is once again a solid, unmoving monument to her discipline. But the most important part of the refresh is the eyes. She takes her black pencil and sharpens the doe-eye flick. She adds another coat of mascara, separating the lashes with that dangerous, tiny pin. She needs her eyes to look wide. She needs them to look awake. She needs them to hide the fact that her soul is crying out for a dark room and a soft pillow. And finally, the lips. The red lip mandate must be renewed. She wipes away the remains of the old color and starts fresh. She outlines the Cupid's bow with surgical precision. She fills in the red, layer after layer, until it is so bright, so bold, that it is the only thing anyone can see. It is a red flag of domestic victory. It is a signal that says, everything is wonderful here. Think about the psychological toll of this second ritual. Betty is preparing herself to be consumed by the gaze of her husband. She is not dressing for herself. She is dressing to confirm his success. She is dressing to prove that his investment in the suburban dream was worth the cost. If she looks perfect, his world is perfect. If she looks tired, the dream has a crack in it. She returns to the bedroom to change her clothes. The starched cotton dress she wore all day, the one that saw the grease from the bacon and the dust from the shelves, is discarded. She puts on a hostess gown or a fresh, floral afternoon dress. It is a dress that has no purpose other than to look beautiful. It has no pockets for tools. It has no reinforcements for labor. It is a garment of leisure, a garment that lies about her day. As she buttons the dress, she feels the torture of the girdle once more. She hasn't taken it off all day, but now she adjusts it, pulling it tighter, forcing her body back into that silhouette of silence. She pinches her waist. She checks her posture. She becomes the ornament again. Now, she moves to the kitchen for the final scenting. The smell of the roast is good, but it is too real. She sprays the air freshener, pine and lavender, masking the smell of the food with the smell of the factory meadow. Hiss. Hiss. She checks the table one last time. The napkins are straight. The silver is gleaming. The laboratory results are simmering on the stove. Everything is ready. The stage is set. But let us look at the hidden labor of this refresh. Betty is now in a state of high chemical alert. The tranquilizer has flattened her emotions, the diet pill has sharpened her focus, and the caffeine is humming in her blood. She is a biological engine running at maximum capacity, but she must appear as if she has spent the afternoon reading a book and sipping tea. This was the grand deception of the 1950s. The husband returns to a house that is clean, a dinner that is hot, and a wife who is beautiful. He assumes this is the natural state of his home. He doesn't see the 16 hours of work. He doesn't see the 3 applications of makeup. He doesn't see the physical pain or the mental fatigue. He sees the result, and he calls it home. Betty hears the sound of the car in the driveway. Her heart gives a small, frantic leap. Not out of love, but out of performance anxiety. She takes one last, desperate look in the hallway mirror. The red lips are bright. The hair is frozen. The dress is crisp. She takes a deep breath, holding it in her chest to keep her stomach flat. She opens the front door just as his key turns in the lock. "Hello, dear," she says, her voice a soft, modulated melody. "How was your day?" She stands there in the doorway, the fading light of the afternoon behind her, looking like a technicolor dream. She looks refreshed. She looks new. She looks as though she has done nothing all day but wait for this moment. And he smiles. He kisses her on the cheek, careful not to smudge the foundation. He sets his briefcase down on the polished mahogany table. "Everything looks wonderful, Betty," he says. And with those words, the afternoon refresh is validated. The labor is erased. The truth is buried. The synthetic goddess has succeeded in her final mission of the day. But as she leads him into the kitchen, as her heels click rhythmically on the linoleum, Betty feels a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. She has spent the last hour creating a version of herself that doesn't exist, to please a man who doesn't truly see her. She is a masterpiece of artifice, standing in a gallery of her own making. The evening has begun. The homecoming is complete. But underneath the fresh powder, underneath the victory red lipstick, the woman from 5 a.m. is still there. She is tired. She is hungry. And she is waiting for the night when she can finally, mercifully, wipe it all away. The house is warm. The table is set. And the afternoon refresh holds the dark truth at bay for just a few hours more. The mask is on. The play continues. And the world, as always, is perfectly, beautifully silent. The sun has finally disappeared, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. The streetlights of the suburb flicker to life, casting a cold, hummed glow over the identical driveways. But inside Betty's home, the atmosphere is shifting. The afternoon refresh has been completed, the children have been fed their early supper, and now the stage is set for the most sophisticated act of the day. We must talk about the cocktail hour mask. In the mid-1950s, the cocktail hour was the high-water mark of suburban social life. It was the moment when the domestic labor was supposed to vanish entirely, replaced by an image of effortless, cosmopolitan leisure. It was a time for gin, vermouth, and thin-stemmed glasses. But for Betty, it was the most exhausting performance of all. Because during the cocktail hour, she was not just a wife, she was a hostess. And a hostess was a woman who lived entirely behind a mask of glass and ice. Imagine the living room now. The invisible white glove test has been passed, and the mahogany tables are gleaming under the soft lamplight. Betty has put on her cocktail dress, perhaps a shimmering black taffeta or a deep emerald silk. It is a dress designed to be seen, not to be moved in. The bodice is tight, the waist is cinched to the point of pain, and the skirt rustles with every calculated step she takes. She stands by the sideboard, arranging the crystal decanters and the small, silver bowls of salted nuts. Clink. Clink. The sound of the ice against the glass is the heartbeat of the evening. But look at her face. The architecture we discussed earlier is now under the pressure of a social gaze. She has added a little more shadow to her eyes, a little more depth to her victory red lips. She is no longer just a woman, she is a centerpiece. The guests arrive. Let's call them the Millers. They step through the door, and immediately the mask is activated. Betty does not greet them with the exhaustion of her 16-hour day. She greets them with a high, melodic laugh, a sound she has practiced to be perfectly charitable and bright. "So wonderful to see you, Martha." "George," she says. Her voice is like a chime, containing no trace of the chemical mother's little helper humming in her blood, or the hunger gnawing at her stomach. She takes their coats with the posture of submission we spoke of, making herself small and graceful as she moves through the hallway. Think about the psychological complexity of this hour. Betty is performing a double shift. She must serve the drinks, she must manage the appetizers, she must ensure the ashtrays are empty before they can even hold a second cigarette, and she must do all of this while participating in a conversation that is designed to be entirely, perfectly empty. They talk about the new station wagon. They talk about the country club dance. They talk about the modern miracles of the latest vacuum cleaner. But they never talk about the truth. Martha doesn't mention the little helper in her own handbag. George doesn't mention the pressure of the corporate ladder. And Betty certainly doesn't mention the fact that she felt like she was disappearing into the floral wallpaper at 3 p.m. The cocktail hour mask is a mask of enviable contentment. Everyone in the room is participating in a silent agreement to pretend that the American dream is exactly as advertised. Betty moves through the room with a tray of canapés. These are the products of her kitchen laboratory, tiny, intricate constructions of white bread, pimento cheese, and olives, held together by toothpicks. They are as synthetic and structured as her own life. She offers them with a slight tilt of her head, a gesture of agreeable service. Think about her physical state during this hour. She is standing on those heels, the heels on linoleum, now walking on plush carpet. The carpet provides a little more cushion, but the fatigue in her calves is now a screaming, throbbing reality. Her girdle is biting into her waist, making it difficult to breathe deeply enough to maintain the high, cheerful tone of her voice. Her sculpted crown of hair feels like a lead weight on her skull. But she cannot slip. If she were to show a moment of weariness, if she were to let her shoulders sag or her smile falter, the mask would crack. And a cracked mask in the suburbs was a social emergency. It would invite concern, and concern was often just a polite word for judgment. So she drinks a single, small glass of sherry, the alcohol mixing with the tranquilizers in her system, creating a strange, detached sensation. She feels as though she is watching herself from the ceiling. She sees the woman in the black dress moving gracefully between the guests. She hears the melodic laugh. She sees the red lips moving. But she is not there. She is a ghost haunting her own party. The conversation turns to the house. "Oh, Betty, your home is always so immaculate," Martha says, her eyes scanning the room for a single flaw. Betty smiles. The red lip mandate is her shield. "Thank you, Martha." "It's no trouble at all," she lies. No trouble at all. Think of the weight of that lie. The 16 hours of labor, the chemical assistance, the physical pain, the invisible white glove test, all of it is dismissed in 4 words. To admit that it took effort would be to admit that she is not a goddess, but a worker. And a worker is not enviable. A worker is common. The cocktail hour is a theater of class. Everything must look expensive, even if it was bought on credit. Everything must look new, even if it is a struggle to maintain. The mask is not just for her face, it is for the entire house. The lamplight is dimmed just enough to hide any imperfections she might have missed, creating a soft, amber-colored illusion of peace. But let us look at the dark truth of this hosting. Behind the smiles, there is a fierce, hidden competition. Betty is watching Martha's jewelry. Martha is watching the brand of the gin Betty's husband is pouring. They are measuring their husband's success through the objects in the room and the poise of the wives. Betty is her husband's trophy, and tonight, she must shine. As the hour stretches on, the mask begins to feel heavy, almost suffocating. The smell of the tobacco smoke, the perfume, and the gin creates a thick, cloying atmosphere. Betty feels a sudden, sharp wave of nausea, but she pushes it down. She takes another, microscopic sip of her sherry. She laughs at a joke George makes, a joke she doesn't really understand, or perhaps a joke that isn't really funny. She is a professional agra. Think of the millions of women performing this same ritual in millions of identical living rooms. The cocktail hour was the glue that held the suburban social fabric together. It was a daily reaffirmation of the order of things. The men spoke of the world, of business, of power. The women spoke of the interior, of the home, of the children, of the modern miracles. They were the curators of the private sphere, ensuring that the public sphere always had a beautiful, serene place to return to. But what of Betty's interior? What of the space inside the mask? Inside, there is a growing, terrifying sense of unreality. She looks at the Millers, she looks at her husband, and they look like cardboard cutouts. Their voices sound like they are coming from a distant radio. She wonders if she were to stop talking, if she were to simply sit down on the floor and close her eyes, would the party continue around her? Or would the whole room vanish like a dream? But she cannot stop. The car door is not yet closed on the evening. There is still dinner to serve, the dinner performance we discussed earlier. There are still dishes to wash. There is still the evening shift of being a wife. The Millers finally stand up to move toward the dining room. Everything is just perfect. Betty, George says, patting his stomach. Betty leads the way. Her rustling silk skirt sounds like a warning. She takes her seat at the foot of the table, her husband at the head. The candles are lit, their flames flickering in the slight draft from the hallway. The cocktail hour mask remains firmly in place. Not a smudge on the eyeliner. Not a hair out of place in the sculpted crown. The red lips are as bold as they were at 5 p.m. She has succeeded. She has hosted. She has performed. She has been the enviable housewife. But as she looks at the shimmering, crystal glass in front of her, she sees her own reflection. The mask is beautiful. The mask is elegant. The mask is everything the world wants her to be. But the woman behind it is gasping for air. The woman behind it is screaming in a frequency that only she can hear. The dinner begins. The silver clinks against the china. Clink. Clink. The sound of a life being lived in a vacuum. The night is deep, and the mask will not be removed for many hours yet. Until then, she will smile. She will laugh. She will be perfect. Because in the world of 1955, the mask was the only thing that kept the darkness from coming inside. The evening dinner has come to an end, the guests have departed into the cool, suburban night, and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway has reclaimed the house. Betty stands at the sink, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water, washing the fine china that she only uses for company. But as she scrubs, her mind is not on the dishes. It is on the invisible bars that surround her. We must talk about the financial cage. In the mid-1950s, the perfect housewife lived in a world of profound material abundance. She had the gleaming appliances, the wall-to-wall carpeting, the station wagon in the driveway, and the beautiful dresses in her closet. But there was a dark, underlying truth to all of this prosperity. None of it belonged to her. Not the house, not the car, and often, not even the money in her own purse. To be a woman in 1955 was to live in a state of permanent, legal, and economic childhood. Imagine Betty opening her heavy leather handbag. Inside, there is a small, gold-clasped coin purse. In it, there are a few crumpled dollar bills and some silver coins. This is her allowance. Every Monday morning, her husband, let's call him Arthur, places a set amount of cash on the kitchen table before he leaves for the office. This is the grocery money. This is the household fund. Betty must stretch these bills to cover every loaf of bread, every gallon of milk, every box of laundry starch, and every new pair of socks for the children. She is the manager of a budget she did not create, using money she did not earn. Think about the psychological impact of this allowance. Betty is a college-educated woman. She was a top student in her class, capable of complex mathematics and deep, critical thinking. But in her marriage, she has to ask for permission to buy a new lipstick. She has to justify the cost of a new pair of stockings if she accidentally snags a pair on the kitchen stool. She is a partner in name, but a dependent in reality. In the 1950s, the law reflected this dependency. In many states, a woman could not open a bank account in her own name without her husband's signature. She could not apply for a credit card. She could not take out a loan to start a small business or go back to school. Her financial identity was entirely swallowed by the man she married. She was a credit risk unless a man stood behind her. This was the golden handcuff. Betty looks out the kitchen window at the dark, quiet street. She sees the lights of the other houses, all of them identical, all of them bought and paid for by the breadwinner. If Betty were to decide tomorrow that she could no longer bear the girdle, the heels, or the mask of perfection, where would she go? She has no savings. She has no escape fund. The very roof over her head is tied to her performance as a wife. If she stops performing, she loses everything. The perfection we have discussed all day, the red lips, the sculpted hair, the immaculate house, is not just a matter of pride. It is a matter of survival. Her beauty and her domestic skill are the only currency she has to pay for her security. Think of the accountability of the household books. Every evening, Arthur might ask, "How much did we spend at the supermarket today, Betty?" And she must produce the receipt. She must show him that she was efficient. She must prove that she is a good investment. If she spent too much on a fancy roast or a new set of floral napkins, she feels a surge of genuine guilt. Not because she was wasteful, but because she has displeased the provider. There is a specific kind of humiliation in being a grown woman who has to sneak a small purchase. Perhaps she saw a book she wanted to read, or a silk scarf that caught her eye at the department store. She buys it, but then she has to find a way to hide the cost in the grocery budget. She shaves a few cents off the meat, a few cents off the soap, until she has saved enough to pay for her own small joy. She is a thief in her own home, stealing from the household fund to feel like an individual for 5 minutes. The financial cage was reinforced by the culture of consumption. The 1950s was an era of keeping up with the Joneses. To look successful, Betty had to buy the newest, the brightest, and the best. But every new appliance she bought, the dishwasher, the dryer, the electric mixer, was another link in the chain of dependency. These modern miracles were sold as time savers, but they were actually asset builders for the husband's estate. Betty works 16 hours a day to maintain the value of the house, to preserve the quality of the furniture, to ensure the children grow up to be productive citizens. But her labor is non-monetized. It has no value in the marketplace. If she were to walk into a bank and say, "I have scrubbed 10,000 floors and served 5,000 perfect meals," they would laugh at her. Her work is invisible to the economy, yet the economy depends entirely on her doing it for free. Let us look at the insurance of marriage. Betty knows that her lifestyle is fragile. If something were to happen to Arthur, an accident, a sudden illness, or even a divorce, her world would shatter instantly. She would be a woman with no experience, a woman who hasn't been in the workforce for a decade. She would be destitute in the middle of a beautiful, suburban paradise. This fear is the silent engine that drives her perfection. Why does she reapply her lipstick at 4 p.m.? Why does she wear heels on linoleum? Why does she take the mother's little helper to stop the crying? Because she cannot afford to be defective. A defective product is replaced. An unhappy wife is a liability. Think of the millions of women who stayed in hollow, loveless, or even abusive marriages because they literally could not afford to leave. They were economic prisoners in floral dresses. They lived in the financial cage with the golden handcuffs, and they were told to be grateful for the cage. As Betty finishes the dishes, she wipes the counter until it is dry and gleaming. She looks at her reflection in the chrome toaster. She sees the goddess. She sees the asset. She sees the investment. But she doesn't see a woman with a future of her own making. In the 1950s, the dark truth was that the suburban dream was a company town. The husband was the company, and the wife was the worker who was paid in a room and board and social status. She was a partner who had no vote. She was a CEO of the home who had no salary. Betty walks into the living room. Arthur is sitting in his armchair, reading the financial section of the newspaper. He is checking his stocks. He is checking his growth. He is checking his world. Betty sits on the edge of the ottoman, her posture of submission still perfect. She looks at him, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, she sees him as her jailer. Not because he is a bad man, he is a good provider, but because he holds the key to her entire existence in his wallet. "Did you get that new vacuum cleaner today?" "Betty," he asks, without looking up. "Yes, dear," she says, her voice soft and melodic. "It's wonderful. Thank you." She is thanking him for the tool she will use to work for him. The financial cage is quiet. The financial cage is comfortable. It is carpeted, air-conditioned, and filled with the scent of pine air freshener. but it is a cage nonetheless. And as Betty sits there in the flickering light of the television, she realizes that the perfect housewife is the most expensive thing her husband owns. And she is the one paying the price, one allowance at a time. The night is deep now. The money is on the table. The bills are paid. And the synthetic goddess remains trapped in the golden handcuffs of the American dream. The dream is prosperous. The dream is secure. But for Betty, the dream is a debt that she can never, ever repay. The house has finally surrendered to the deep, heavy silence of the midnight hour. The television has flickered to a stop, leaving only a faint, static hum in the living room. The children are safe in their dreams, and Arthur is asleep, his breathing steady and untroubled in the darkness. But for Betty, the day is not yet over. There is one final ritual. The most honest, and the most terrifying ritual of all. We must talk about the mirror's betrayal. Betty stands alone in the pink-tiled bathroom. The door is locked. This is the only room in the house where she is allowed to be a private being, and even here, she is accompanied by her reflection. The harsh, clinical light of the fluorescent bulb above the vanity is cold. It does not hide anything. It does not forgive. It stares back at her with the same, unrelenting judgment she has felt all day long. She looks at the synthetic goddess in the glass. The architecture of the face is still there, but it is starting to fail. The foundation is heavy, caked into the fine lines around her eyes, lines that were born from 1,000 artificial smiles. The victory red lipstick is still bold, but the edges have blurred, looking like a wound that refuses to heal. Her eyes, framed by layers of stiff, black mascara, look wide and glassy, the eyes of a woman who has forgotten how to blink. She reaches for the jar of cold cream. The lid unscrews with a soft, familiar click. She takes a thick dollop of the white, waxy substance and begins to apply it to her face. This is the moment of deconstruction. As she rubs the cream into her skin, the mask begins to dissolve. The black liner smudges, the red lipstick smears across her cheeks, and the porcelain foundation turns into a muddy, gray residue. She takes a clean, white cloth and begins to wipe. Swipe. Swipe. With every movement of the cloth, a piece of the goddess is removed. The dough vanishes, revealing the tired, heavy lids beneath. The Cupid's bow is erased, revealing the thin, pale lips that have spent the day holding back 1,000,000 unspoken words. The glow is wiped away, revealing the sallow, exhausted skin of a human being who has been starved of sunlight, rest, and truth. As the makeup comes off, the mirror begins its betrayal. It shows her the face she has tried so hard to forget. It shows her the aging, the fatigue, and the sheer, overwhelming ordinariness of her own features. Without the paint, she is just a woman. She is not a symbol of prosperity. She is not a trophy. She is just Betty. And Betty is a stranger. She stares at the pale, naked face in the glass. She touches her cheek, her fingers feeling the actual texture of her skin for the first time in nearly 20 hours. It feels cold. It feels fragile. She looks into her own pupils, searching for the girl she used to be. The girl who studied literature. The girl who wanted to travel to Paris. The girl who thought her life would be a great, unfolding adventure. Where did she go? The mirror offers no answer. It only reflects the silence of the room. Next, she turns to the sculpted crown. She begins the slow, painful process of brushing out the lacquer. The hairspray has turned her hair into a rigid cage of shellac. As she pulls the brush through the tangles, she hears the tiny, snapping sounds of the fibers breaking. Snap. Snap. Each snap is a small, sharp pain in her scalp. It is the sound of her discipline being undone. The volume collapses. The pageboy flip disappears. The bangs fall limp against her forehead. Her hair, once a majestic, unmoving monument, now looks dull, dry, and lifeless. It falls around her shoulders in a messy, chaotic heap. Without the crown, she feels small. She feels exposed. She feels unprotected. Then, she reaches for the zipper at the back of her dress. She steps out of the floral cotton, the fabric falling to the floor in a heap of starched silence. And then, she faces the ultimate instrument of her suppression. The girdle. She unhooks the garters from her stockings, the metal clips cold against her fingertips. She unfastens the row of hooks and eyes, each one a release, each one a confession. And then, she begins to peel the heavy, elastic garment away from her body. As the girdle falls away, her body reactively expands. She takes a deep, shuddering breath, the first full breath she has taken since 5 o'clock this morning. Her lungs fill with air, her ribs expand, and her stomach, no longer compressed into a hard, flat plane, settles into its natural, soft shape. But the mirror does not let her enjoy the relief. It shows her the red, angry welts the elastic has left in her skin. It shows her the deep, horizontal lines across her waist where the boning has dug in all day. It shows her the bruises on her thighs from the garter clips. Her body is a map of her own confinement. It is a record of the violence she has done to herself to fit into the American dream. She looks at her naked body, and she feels a sense of profound, crushing shame. Why? Because her body is not perfect. It is soft where it should be firm. It is marked where it should be smooth. It is human where it should be synthetic. The culture has taught her to hate her own flesh, to see her natural form as a betrayal of her husband's expectations. The mirror is a weapon. In the 1950s, the mirror was the primary tool of the housewife's self-surveillance. It was the judge that never slept. Even now, in the middle of the night, Betty is auditing herself. Is she too fat? Are there more wrinkles? Is she losing the war against time? She leans in closer, her breath fogging the glass. She sees a small, gray hair near her temple. A tiny thread of reality. She immediately reaches for the tweezers. Pluck. The pain is sharp, but the hair is gone. She cannot allow the betrayal to begin. She cannot allow the truth to grow. Think of the psychological weight of this midnight hour. This is the moment when the problem that has no name is most visible. In the silence of the pink bathroom, Betty realizes that she is a ghost. She has spent the entire day building a woman who doesn't exist, for a family that doesn't truly know her, in a house that she doesn't own. She has been the actress, the technician, the hostess, and the goddess. But here, in the mirror, she sees the nobody. A single tear begins to track down her cheek, cutting through the last remains of the cold cream. She doesn't stop it. She watches it fall. It is the only natural, thing that has happened to her face all day. But then, she hears a sound. A floorboard creaks in the hallway. Immediately, the internal gendarme wakes up. Betty's spine straightens. Her hand goes to her face, wiping the tear away with the back of her hand. She checks the lock on the door. She cannot be seen like this. Not in this state of deconstruction. Not in this state of truth. The car door is closed on the day, but the performance never truly ends. Even in her own bathroom, she is a fugitive. She quickly washes her face with cold, stinging water. She brushes her teeth, the taste of the peppermint masking the taste of the mother's little helper and the gin from the cocktail hour. She puts on her nightgown, a long, modest, lace-trimmed garment of white silk. It is another costume, a costume for the bedroom performance. She looks at the mirror one last time before she turns off the light. The face staring back is clean, pale, and utterly, hauntingly empty. The mask is gone, but the woman who was supposed to be underneath it is missing. Betty realizes that she has spent so many years being the housewife that there is nothing left of Betty. She is a hollow statue, a porcelain shell. She clicks the light switch. The bathroom is plunged into darkness. The mirror vanishes. The betrayal is hidden once more. She walks back into the bedroom, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. She slides into the bed beside Arthur. He is still asleep, a mountain of blankets and ignored reality. She lies on her back, perfectly straight, her hands folded over her chest. She is careful not to move, careful not to breathe too loudly. In the dark truth remains. She is hungry. She is tired. And she is terrified of tomorrow morning. Because tomorrow morning at 5 a.m., she has to do it all again. She has to build the goddess from the ruins of the nobody. She has to paint the mask over the betrayal. The house is quiet. The world is asleep. And Betty lies there, staring into the blackness, waiting for the sun to rise, so she can begin the long, beautiful, synthetic lie of her life once more. The mirror is waiting for her. The red lipstick is waiting for her. The girdle is waiting for her. And the silence, as always, has the final word. The night has reached its deepest point, that hollow hour between 3 and 4 in the morning when the world seems to hold its breath. The house is a dark, silent museum of mid-century perfection. Every object is in its place. The silver is polished. The linoleum is waxed. The mask has been washed away in the pink-tiled bathroom. But in the darkness of the master bedroom, Betty is awake. She lies perfectly still, her eyes tracing the familiar patterns of the shadows on the ceiling. We must talk about the legacy of the buried self. In the world of 1955, we have seen the labor, the beauty, the chemistry, and the finance. But what of the soul? What happens to a human being when they are required to spend every waking second of every day pretending to be someone else? What happens when your thoughts, your dreams, and your very identity are treated as obstacles to your family's happiness? The answer is a slow, quiet burial. Betty remembers a version of herself from a time before the white picket fence. She remembers a girl who sat in university lecture halls, her heart racing with the thrill of ideas. She remembers a girl who wrote passionate essays about the future, a girl who spoke with a voice that was loud, certain, and her own. That girl had a name that wasn't just Mother or Mrs. Arthur Miller. That girl had a self. But then, the world changed. The war ended, the men returned, and the synthetic goddess was born. Betty was told that her education was a fine ornament, but not a tool for a career. She was told that her true fulfillment would be found in the shine of a floor and the smile of a child. And so, she began the process of burying the girl she used to be. She dug a hole in the back of her mind, and she placed her ambitions, her intellect, and her anger inside it. She covered it with a layer of floral wallpaper and a thick coat of victory red lipstick. Think about the psychological cost of this burial. To bury the self is to live in a state of permanent, internal exile. Betty walks through her house, but she feels like a ghost visiting a life that doesn't belong to her. She cooks the meals, she cleans the rooms, she hosts the parties, but there is no I in her actions. There is only the role. She has become a masterpiece of function, but she has lost the capacity for being. This was the problem that has no name, as the writer Betty Friedan would later call it. It was a collective, silent ache that throbbed in the hearts of millions of women across the American suburbs. It wasn't that they didn't love their children, or that they hated their husbands. It was that they were starving for a sense of purpose that the kitchen laboratory could not provide. They were educated for the world, and then confined to a cage. Betty lies there in the dark, and she feels the weight of that buried self. It is like a second heart, beating in a frequency that she has learned to ignore. But tonight, in the silence, it is loud. It asks her questions. Is this all? Is this the end of the story? Who are you when no one is looking? She thinks about her college degree, the one framed and hanging in the back of the hallway, near the utility closet. It is a piece of paper that testifies to a mind that once mattered. Now, it is just a decoration, a reminder of a path not taken. She uses the same analytical brain that once solved complex equations to calculate the price of laundry detergent and the timing of a pot roast. It is a tragic waste of human potential, disguised as domestic bliss. Think of the legacy this burial leaves behind. It isn't just about Betty's own sadness. It is about the world she is building for her children. Her daughter, let's call her Susan, is watching her. Susan sees the mask. Susan hears the melodic voice. Susan observes the posture of submission. And Susan is learning. She is learning that to be a woman is to be small. To be a woman is to serve. To be a woman is to hide. The buried self is a haunted legacy. Betty wants to tell her daughter to run. She wants to tell her to keep her voice loud, to keep her mind open, to never let anyone tell her that a kitchen is the limit of her universe. But she cannot. Because to say those things would be to admit that her own life is a lie. And Betty is not yet ready to break the mask. So she continues to teach the ritual. She teaches Susan how to set the table. She teaches her how to apply the lipstick. She is passing on the shovel to the next generation, helping them bury themselves before they even have a chance to grow. But let us look at the physical symptoms of the buried self. When the mind is suppressed, the body speaks. This is why Betty has the suburban migraines. This is why her back is in a permanent state of tension. This is why she needs Mother's little helper to get through the afternoon. The buried self is trying to scream, and since it has no voice, it uses pain. It uses fatigue. It uses the hollow ache in her chest. In the 1950s, these symptoms were treated as female complaints. They were dismissed by doctors as the result of a nervous disposition. But they were actually the tremors of an earthquake. The buried self was moving beneath the surface. Millions of Bettys were feeling the same tremor at the same time. Think about the silence of the suburbs at this hour. In every house, there is likely a woman awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the same problem that has no name. They are all isolated in their individual sanctuaries, unaware that they are part of a collective tragedy. The perfection of the neighborhood depends on their isolation. If they were to speak to each other, if they were to share the truth of the buried self, the white picket fences would crumble overnight. But for now, the silence holds. Betty thinks about the mask waiting for her on the vanity. It is more than just makeup. It is a tombstone. Every morning, when she applies the foundation and the eyeliner, she is performing a burial service for the woman she was meant to be. She is saying goodbye to the artist, the scientist, the traveler, and hello to the housewife. It is a daily sacrifice of the soul on the altar of the American home. There is a profound, quiet anger in this legacy. It is an anger that has nowhere to go. It cannot be directed at the husband, he is a good provider. It cannot be directed at the children, they are innocent. So it is directed inward. It becomes depression. It becomes anxiety. It becomes the synthetic feeling of a life lived through a glass pane. Betty shifts slightly under the covers. The lace of her nightgown is itchy, another minor discomfort in a life made of major restrictions. She thinks about the morning. In 2 hours, the sun will rise. In 2 hours, she will become the synthetic goddess once again. She will build the architecture of the face, she will endure the torture of the girdle, and she will perform the breakfast performance. But tonight, in this dark, honest hour, she allows herself to remember. She remembers the smell of the old library books. She remembers the sound of her own laughter, not the melodic laugh of the hostess, but the real, deep, messy laughter of a girl who was free. She holds that memory in her mind like a precious, stolen jewel. This is the legacy of the buried self. It is a secret history. A history that isn't written in the textbooks of the 1950s, but is written in the hearts of a million women. It is a history of what was not done, what was not said, and who was not allowed to exist. As she finally feels the pull of sleep, Betty makes a silent promise to the girl in the hole. "I haven't forgotten you," she whispers into the darkness. "You are still here, underneath the wallpaper. You are still here, underneath the wax." It is a small, fragile hope. But in the world of the synthetic goddess, hope is a dangerous thing. It is the crack in the porcelain. It is the smudge on the eyeliner. The house is cold. The night is ending. And Betty, the housewife, the goddess, the ghost, finally closes her eyes. The buried self waits in the dark, patient, silent, and unyielding. Waiting for the day when the ground will finally break. Waiting for the day when the mask will be torn away for good. Until then, the silence of the suburb remains. The house is perfect. The dream is secure. And the dark truth remains buried, deep beneath the roots of the white picket fence, waiting for the light. The first faint, ghostly sliver of light is beginning to touch the edges of the heavy floral curtains. It is nearly 5 a.m. once again. The cycle is preparing to reset. The vacuum is waiting in the closet, the cold cream is waiting on the vanity, and the red lipstick is waiting in its gold-plated tomb. But as we stand at the end of this long, dark night, we must talk about the inevitable. We must talk about the cracks in the porcelain. In the mid-1950s, the world looked as though it were made of glass and steel, unchanging, polished, and permanent. The synthetic goddess was supposed to reign forever over her pastel kingdom. But no mask can be worn for a lifetime without eventually shattering. No cage, no matter how beautifully gilded, can hold a human spirit indefinitely. Even as Betty lies there, preparing to wake up and begin the performance once more, the cracks are already forming. They start small, almost invisible to the naked eye. A crack in the porcelain is a moment of hesitation. It is the second it takes for Betty to put on her red-lipped smile when her husband walks through the door. It is the way her hand trembles, just for a fraction of an inch, as she applies her eyeliner in the harsh morning light. It is the silence that lasts a heartbeat too long when a neighbor asks, "Are you happy, dear?" These are the tiny fissures in the foundation of the American dream. Think about the physical reality of porcelain. It is beautiful, smooth, and white. But it is also brittle. It cannot bend. It can only hold, or it can break. And Betty has been holding for so long. She has held her breath in the torture of the girdle. She has held her tongue in the posture of submission. She has held her tears behind the architecture of the face. She is a woman made of tension, and tension always seeks a release. The cracks began to spread across the suburbs in the late 1950s, moving from house to house like a quiet, infectious whisper. It wasn't a revolution of fire and shouting, not yet. It was a revolution of discontent. It was the moment when millions of Bettys looked at their gleaming, modern refrigerators and realized that a machine cannot love you back. It was the moment they realized that a perfectly waxed floor is a lonely place to stand. Imagine the shattering of the image. It often happened in the most mundane of moments. Perhaps it was a morning like this, when the alarm didn't go off, and for the first time in 10 years, Betty let her husband see her without her mask. She let him see the messy hair, the tired eyes, the pale, human lips. And in that moment, the synthetic goddess died. The illusion was broken, and once the truth is seen, it can never be unseen. But the cracks in the porcelain were also fueled by the very things that were supposed to keep the women quiet. The mother's little helper, tranquilizers that were meant to sedate the sadness, began to create a hollow, disconnected world that women no longer wanted to inhabit. The education that was supposed to be a fine ornament began to demand a purpose. The financial cage began to feel too small for a soul that wanted to fly. Betty looks at her hands in the dim, pre-dawn light. They are the hands of a worker, but they are also the hands of an artist who never painted, a writer who never wrote, a thinker who was never heard. She realizes that the dark truth is not just about the pain of the heels or the weight of the hairspray. It is about the loss of time. The thousands of hours she spent chasing dust, when she could have been chasing the sun. Think of the legacy we are leaving behind as this story ends. The 1950s was a decade of great forgetting. A decade where the world tried to pretend that women were not fully human, but were instead domestic appliances with heartbeats. But the 1960s were coming. The era of the shattering was just around the corner. The children who watched the breakfast performance every morning would grow up to be the ones who tore down the curtains. They would be the ones who refused to wear the girdle, who refused to paint the mask, who refused to live in the silhouette of silence. Betty's sacrifice was the fuel for their rebellion. Her quiet, buried suffering was the soil in which the next generation's freedom would grow. But Betty, our synthetic goddess, is still here. She is still trapped in 1955. The sun is finally rising. The orange glow is spreading across the floor, illuminating the polished mahogany and the floral wallpaper. The grandfather clock strikes 5. Chime. Chime. Betty sits up in bed. Her back is stiff. Her feet are already aching in anticipation of the heels. She reaches for her silk robe, the pink feathers shivering in the cool morning air. She walks toward the bathroom. She stands before the mirror. The mirror's betrayal we spoke of earlier is still there. She sees the cracks in her own porcelain. She sees the fine lines, the tired gaze, the truth that foundation can no longer hide. She picks up the jar of cold cream. But then, she stops. Her hand stays midair, hovering over the silver lid. She looks at her reflection, and for the first time, she doesn't see a project. She doesn't see a failure. She sees a survivor. She sees a woman who has endured a decade of perfection and is still standing. She looks at the red lipstick, the victory red that has been her uniform for so long. She realizes that she doesn't need victory anymore. She needs truth. She doesn't open the jar. Instead, she turns on the cold water and splashes it over her face. She feels the shock of it, the raw, natural coldness. She doesn't wipe it away with a scented towel. She lets the water drip down her neck. She lets herself feel. It is a small rebellion. A tiny, silent crack in the porcelain. She will still make the breakfast. She will still put on the dress. She will still smile the red-lipped smile for the neighbors. But something has changed. The buried self has reached the surface. The mask is now just a costume, no longer her identity. She knows now that she is a human being, and that her ordinariness is the most beautiful thing about her. The house is waking up. Arthur is stirring in the bedroom. The children will soon be calling for their juice. The breakfast performance must begin. But as Betty walks into the kitchen, as her heels click on the linoleum, the sound is different. It is no longer the sound of a prisoner walking in circles. It is the sound of a woman counting the steps until she is free. The 1950s were a dream, a beautiful, synthetic, suffocating dream. But dreams always end with the dawn. And as the sun fills the kitchen, reflecting off the chrome toaster and the white refrigerator, the porcelain is finally, mercifully, breaking. The dark truth has been told. The secrets have been whispered into the night. The perfect housewife is a ghost of the past, and the woman is beginning to wake up. Close your eyes now. Let the sound of the ticking clock carry you away from the pastel walls and the white picket fences. Let the mask fall away. You are safe now. You are free to be human. You are free to be messy. You are free to be real. The story of the synthetic goddess has ended. The history is written. And the silence, for the first time, is not a cage, but a peace. Good night, Betty. Good night to the millions of selves that were buried and are now being found. Sleep now. The cracks are beautiful. The light is coming through. And the world, finally, is yours to breathe in.